Hello, and welcome to everybody joining us for this webinar. Let me start by wishing you all a very good morning from Ann Arbor in Michigan, where the time is 11 a.m. Eastern Time on a rather gray and rainy morning. A good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from the UK, and a very good evening to colleagues who are joining us from India and Pakistan. My name is Arvind-Pal Singh Mandair, and I teach in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. This is the third event in our regular webinar series in Sikh and Punjab studies. And just to remind you, these webinars happen 3 times a year in January, April, and September. The recordings of earlier webinars are available on our website, and you can find a link to that in our chat, or it's something that will be made available to you fairly shortly. Support for the webinar series comes from the Sikh Studies Endowment at the University of Michigan. I want to thank the College of Literature, Arts and Sciences and the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures for their logistical support for our Punjab and Sikh Studies outreach activities. And a special word of thanks to Alex Prosy, who does all of the background and technical work in putting this webinar together. The Sikh and Punjab Studies webinar is one component of a multi-pronged project, which includes the academic journal Sikh Formations, and under the Sikh Formations banner, several new initiatives that have been coming together over the past year or so, a dedicated blog, a podcast, and of course, this webinar series. The webinar itself has several main objectives. Firstly, to connect scholars and students across different disciplines in Sikh and Punjab studies, and to widen access to research in this rapidly growing field, especially to artists, journalists, and also to the wider community. Each of the webinars will be co-hosted by members of the Sikh Formations team. And in that regard, I'm particularly delighted to welcome my colleagues, Dr. Anneeth Hundle from University of California, Irvine, and Dr. Harjeet Grewal from the University of Calgary in Canada, and both of them are on screen here. Dr. Aggarwal will be chairing the second session, and Dr. Hundle will be chairing our third and final session today. A quick word about the Q&A function. I'm going to bring Alex Prosy on to say a few words about that before I formally introduce our first speaker.
Hi, so for the Q&A function for Zoom participants, please feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentations. In fact, it'll be helpful if you ask them as you think of them so that our moderators can gather them up and present them to the speakers in a timely manner. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. So for today's event, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all 3 presenters, Dr. Yamini Aggarwal, Dr. Radhika Chopra, and Dr. Jyotsna Singh, who will be speaking on 3 very different topics: Sikh schools, curating martyrs in Amritsar, and some reflections on the city of Chandigarh, its history and architecture. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Yamini Aggarwal. Yamini Aggarwal received her PhD in sociology sociology in education from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2020. Her doctoral thesis explored the role of minority schools in promoting the notion of an ideal religious identity and shaping student opinions and aspirations. Yamini's interests are in minority education, conflict and education, gender and urban marginality, and she's published a variety of papers in international journals. Yamini has worked with the Max Planck Forum for South Asian Studies since 2018, where she is currently working on a project on the impact of COVID-19 on girls' education in a marginalized neighborhood. She also teaches sociology and social work as a guest lecturer at the NSIT in Delhi. So welcome, Dr. Aggarwal, and the floor is yours. You're muted.
Thank you. I hope I'm clear. My voice is audible.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking you, Professor Mandair, for giving me this opportunity, and Alex, really, for coordinating the whole thing. So the title of my talk today is Sikh Schools in Delhi, Identity and Aspirations and Ethnographic Analysis. Though the talk today is based on my doctoral research, I would like to begin by going to the background of it. That is how I decided to work on Sikh minority schools. So the research on Sikh schools was an extension of my MPhil dissertation back in 2014, which was based on the education of the survivors of the 1984 anti-Sikh violence in Delhi. This study was based on the lives of a few female survivors who were between 11 and 16 years at the time of the riots. And it was found that the survivors were studying in mixed or government institutions before the violence. But later on, as parents, 30 years later, they were particularly choosing Sikh schools for their children. And there were many reasons behind the choice, mainly that these survivors who were now living in Tilak Vihar or the colony of widows wanted their children to understand their identities as Sikhs and learn the religious and cultural practices of Sikhism. So they viewed Sikh schools as spaces where their children could become Sikh and also adopt the Khalsa identity. So those who were baptized were also receiving scholarships such as complete tuition fee waiver, and hence the schools were seen as providing good opportunity for education. So this prompted my later study, and though I also explored Sikh education in the colonial context, I begin today by looking at Sikh schools in Delhi after the 1984 riots and the changed demographics of these schools post the neoliberal policies of the Indian government. So as part of the other two themes, I briefly touch upon some challenges that have emerged in these schools in terms of experiences of Sikh students as the schools align with the normative Sikh imagery. And secondly, I look at some conflicts that have emerged in these institutions in lieu of the rise of students from other religious communities. So I begin from the post-1984 riots in Delhi, and we know that the 1984 anti-Sikh violence was a watershed movement in the history of the Sikh community. The socio-emotional impact on the community, the loss of lives and livelihood, and dropout from schools and colleges of children and young adults who survived but lost families has yet to be fully captured in research. Now, before the riots, in terms of schools by Sikh managements, there were about 7 by the Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee in Delhi and around 20 across India, but mostly in urban areas. And there were also a few Khalsa schools in Delhi at that time. Now the riots disrupted the education of Sikh students, especially those from the working and lower middle classes. The world of possibility that lay ahead of these young survivors was shattered. So the study that I conducted in Delhi in 2014, it sought to capture the pre and post 1984 riots educational lives of these young women survivors who lost either or both parents. And it found that all survivors, irrespective of their social class, left schools immediately. Some did return to schools only to leave them within few months due to financial or psychological challenges. So girls were either married within a couple of years or stayed at home to look after their younger siblings as their mothers went to work. The experiences of school-going children described the trauma that they had suffered, which was never fully addressed through counseling or such support. Now, in terms of Sikh schools, particularly after the riots, parents who suffered during the violence, they looked towards schools run by Sikh managements for their children's education out of a sense of fear, and Sikh schools were seen as keeping them safe. So evidence from younger siblings of the survivors in my study suggests that they too faced hostility and alienation in mixed classrooms, giving an impetus to the community to search for Sikh institutions. for those survivors who were moved to Tilak Vihar, or the colony of widows, like I said, a Sikh managed school was only established in 1995, 11 years after the violence. By then, many young survivors had already dropped out from schools. So in terms of an overview of Sikh schools between 1984 and roughly till late 1990s, there was also an increased emphasis on Khalsa identity within the community after the riots. The fact that Sikh men and young boys had to cut their hair to save themselves from the rioters, incidents that have been recorded in detail over the years, it led the community to reinforce the importance of outward identity markers. And it was in Sikh schools that these identity aspirations could be met. So institutions of the Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee made wearing of turban by male students and salwar kameez by female students after class 7 mandatory in its schools after the violence. Baptism was encouraged and cutting hair was totally prohibited. So these various factors led to Sikh managements establishing schools in large numbers. So by the turn of the century, the Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee had nearly 15 schools in Delhi, and there were also other 46 schools by other Sikh managements. And schemes such as complete tuition fee waiver and scholarship for baptized Sikh students were also provided in these schools, indicating at the attempt to encourage the normative Sikh identity on students. Now, post 1990s, the context changed with the introduction of neoliberal policies of the Indian government, which saw the spread of markets in school education. Private schools started to replace what was largely the government-provided education, introducing technology-driven infrastructure and education. Besides the market in education, India also saw opening up of new sectors in engineering and ICT, an influx of multinational corporations, basically breaking down the traditional occupational structures with more opportunities emerging in these new global sectors. So as is typical of market systems, those with better social and economic capitals, they benefited from this changed landscape of school education. And here I'm referring to Delhi. So a sharp class divide in education was seen in Sikh schools. So even though Sikh institutions were being established in large numbers, by the end of 1990s, upper and middle class Sikhs started to leave them for reputed private and international schools. The evidence here is based on my doctoral research, based on 2 Sikh schools in Delhi run by the same management. So I'm calling the first school JVS, which was located in an upmarket neighborhood of Delhi and was considered the model branch of the management. Now, when I conducted my research, JVS only had 30% Sikh students of its total about 3,000 students. And I'm referring to the second school as AGS, which I will discuss later. Now, interviews with teachers from both the schools and management members reveal that parental strategies among the Sikhs, beginning roughly a few years after the turn of the century, saw a marked shift towards private schools that would open opportunities in the local and, more importantly, the global job market. It was these private schools that were seen as giving a competitive edge to the children of upper and middle class Sikh parents to acquire such cultural and social capital that would widen their market chances. Now, there are several reasons cited for the withdrawal of these classes of Sikh parents from Sikh schools. My interviews suggest that new private and international schools are providing better infrastructure and subject choices, including foreign languages, which parents from these classes appear to prefer. The religious and cultural education is not seen as important within the space of the school, as told by teachers, as new values in terms of marketability are attached to education. In fact, many upper and middle class Sikh parents, they engage in private tuitions in Punjabi and divinity. These are 2 mandatory subjects in these Sikh schools. So these parents, they engage in private tuitions in these 2 subjects at home while their children study in other private schools. So in case of JVS, it was surrounded by some of the most sought after private schools in Delhi. Sikh students who remained there were mostly from the middle or professional classes, and their parents revealed that the school was their last choice for admission. The parents had tried in all nearby schools, not just in the primary, but the middle classes as well. JVS was cited as a constrained choice based on some of the arguments that I mentioned earlier. However, a few Sikh students in the sample had in fact joined the schools in the secondary classes. They studied in other schools initially, where they reported to being bullied for their outward identity markers, specifically the turban, and hence their parents decided to admit them to these schools. So these variations indicate that Sikh schools and the choice of a Sikh school, is complex, where identity and religion are not seen as important within the realm of education. But the experiences in other schools are often a reason now why Sikh parents return to these schools in later years. Now, despite these emerging challenges, the management was quite committed to promoting the Khalsa identity as the ideal identity within the schools through both its curricular and co-curricular activities. And I briefly present some of the experiences of Sikh students and how they experience these institutions. The process of learning to be Sikh in schools is multifaceted and multi-layered. Besides the outward display of identity, it involves acquiring characteristics that are considered appropriate for being Sikh. While all students interviewed identified as Sikhs and said that they believed in Sikhism, there were different ways in which individual students viewed their identity. So it was common for the baptized students to refer to them as real Sikhs and non-baptized to see themselves as not proper or Sikhs, but not real Sikhs. This was so because the schools aligned with the conservative version of Sikhism, overlooking the fact that many diversities existed in the classrooms. The spatial aspects of the schools, that is, their walls with pictures and boards representing Sikh gurus, messages on Sikhism, the Gurudwara on both campuses, the morning prayers, as well as pedagogy, textbooks, co-curricular activities, and in particular the dress, sought to reinforce the normative Sikh identity on students, which many did not appreciate and also were not keen to stick to. So, disciplining and punishing students are important actions in schools towards socializing students into a particular ideology. The management mandated several punishments and disciplinary action against students for flouting rules. These pertain mainly to not following its guidelines on maintaining the Sikh identity norms in school. Sikh parents had to sign an undertaking at the time of admission that their children would follow the dress code and not cut their hair. If defied, the management prescribed actions like permanent or temporary suspension. One of the management's main goals was to influence students to baptize at a young age. Teachers said baptism was both morally and practically good for students and believed that it made them better in studies. Baptized students were also made to feel special in their schools as they were referred to as ideal students, and various school practices and daily interaction with teachers and school authorities made baptized students feel different from others. So they were presented with numerous opportunities that gave them a higher status in schools. They were the first ones to be selected for extracurricular activities like Gurmat quiz, music, turban tying competitions. Male baptized students were selected to be Panch Pyaras during Nagar Kirtan, while female baptized students were appointed to read the Gurbani, etc. The schools also organized events and conferences during school hours, as well as tour of a Gurdwara in Dehradun each year during summer, where members of the management's Dharam Prachara committee would encourage students to baptize. But ironically, these most baptized students had said during interviews that they had taken the Amrit after their families came to know about the tuition fee waiver. Students had baptized at a young age and said that it had been a difficult journey for them, waking up early for part, compromising on their study hours, especially during exams, tying the turban in the morning and keeping it on throughout the day, were mentioned by male participants as tough. Some said they felt odd when they could not share their friends' food, especially when hanging out with them outside school. So, students had these regrets, but they had been made to believe by their parents and schools that theirs was a complete Sikh identity. These were constructs of being ideal and good students that had been created by the schools, and having these qualities had brought them appreciation both in their institutions and at their home. Imposition of rigid gender codes and control of sexuality also appeared integral to baptized identity. Girls, specifically, they compared themselves to non-baptized Sikh girls and also even those from other religions, and felt that being simple and being close to God was the ideal way of life. And disciplining the body appeared an important constituent of being baptized. More importantly, it had led to a control over their sexuality, supported both by teachers and parents. Being baptized, students felt kept them away from having a relationship at a young age, which some said, quote unquote, was dishonorable. But even baptized students grappled with their identity. Self-denial, individual faults, inadequacies, and guilt underlined their day-to-day activities. And young students appeared to believe that even after baptism, they had a long way to go before they could be complete Sikhs. Through pedagogy and on various occasions, the schools reminded students of the sacrifices of the gurus and encouraged them to not give up on their outward identity markers. Striving hard for their religion and postponing gratification were also seen as qualities of good students by teachers and appreciated, which made students not question what was being imposed to them in the schools. So what dilemmas go on in the minds of these young adults who are slowly trained to accept this identity is complex. There are also some other issues pertaining to Sikh students with several contradictions and ambivalences and their identity that I thought of raising, and I can take questions after the presentation. But the third part of my presentation today is to look at some of the conflicts that have emerged in Sikh schools because of the increase in the number of students from other religious communities. So I discussed this in the context of the other school where I conducted my research. I'm calling it AGS, but these issues were common to both the institutions. Now, broadly, the aspiration for English medium education percolated to the lower, middle, and working classes by the turn of the century, taking the literacy rate of India to 70% by 2001 and of the Sikhs to 69.4%. This in part led to the rise of what are known as low-fee private schools, which are mostly unrecognized and have over the years faced criticism over quality of education provided in them. So here one needs to acknowledge the learning opportunities provided by Sikh schools, specifically to low-income parents, mainly the Sikhs, but also to children from other communities as well. From the 1990 onwards, Sikh managements established schools in neighborhoods where Sikhs resided even in small numbers. So these were often marginalized or unauthorized areas which had either no schools in the vicinity or were breeding grounds for these low-fee, unrecognized schools. So AGS that I'm talking about was located in one such unauthorized peri-urban area, and only 5% of its total 4,000 enrolled students were Sikhs. So yet it was among the most popular and sought after schools in the neighborhood and around, providing an institutional space to students who were often the first generation in their families to go to school. For these families in the vicinity, the school's various minority schemes and scholarships to Amritdhari students were the best option to fulfill the mobility aspirations for their children. Parents from other religious communities also strategized for admission to this school, which was considered academically good as compared to other available options in the neighborhood. However, Sikh managements are yet to fully acknowledge the presence of students of other religious backgrounds in their schools and offer a more inclusive pedagogy. My research pointed to many conflicts within the institutions emerging from classroom diversity and a lack of dialogue among management and teachers on ways to make the school space more equitable and inclusive. Interviews with students and parents from other religious backgrounds revealed interesting insights, and I discuss some here. Nearly all students from other religious affiliations in my sample wanted to shift to other schools a few years after admission to their present one. The mandatory study of Punjabi and divinity was a major source of contention, as these were senior students who wanted to focus on their core subjects. But admission to Delhi in better schools is quite a long drawn process, which parents were not willing to take on again. Besides the commitment to Khalsa identity, the schools were at pains to emphasize on the secular dimensions as well. But the ways in which these students experience the school space was quite different. In the case of morning prayers, for instance, based solely on Sikh ethos, these students appeared to take least interest. Most said they did not understand them, especially the parts that were in Punjabi, and simply stood there as mute participants. These were specifically difficult to comprehend for those who had joined the schools in senior classes and did not understand the language. The experience of Muslim students with regards to pedagogy showed that in many ways the sentiments of students from other religions were not taken into consideration, despite the classrooms being culturally plural. For instance, these students pointed to lessons in divinity, which presented the historic battles between Sikhs and the Mughals. They felt Muslims were projected in a poor light in these historic stories and led to them feeling a sense of exclusion and raised questions from their peers. There was no dialogue about these sensitive issues among students and teachers. Now, there were also several cultural activities of the schools based on Sikh ethos, like celebration of Guru's birthdays and Nagar Kirtan. Most students from other religious communities said they tried to avoid participating in them. And those who did, like the ones I met during two separate Nagar Kirtans, were not aware of the significance of the event and said they had to participate as their teachers had made attendance mandatory. Many students reported that their achievements were also not recognized, and schools gave positions of honor like choice of head boy or head girl in the senior classes to Sikh students as far as possible. So, in conclusion, parents from Sikh classes are strategizing for admission to other private schools and choose Sikh managed schools as a constrained option. On the other hand, for parents of lower and working classes, these schools provide the opportunity to study in an officially recognized English medium school. Hence, parental strategies when it comes to Sikh schools are complex and based on their social class and their location. Schools are enablers in many ways, but constrain students in terms of their identity. The attempt to enforce commitment to outward identity markers does not often find support among Sikh students who are imagining their futures outside of the boundaries of the schools and in multiple global contexts. So I've not discussed these in detail due to limitation of time, but Sikh students were not sure if they wanted to carry the outward identity markers once they left the schools. For instance, so that the identities are fluid and contextual were emphasized by the actions of parents and students. For instance, parents from the lower and working classes had baptized along with the children, like I said, to avail of fee waivers, but insisted that they were not very rigid about following the norms in their day-to-day life outside the schools. Also, parents from these classes who aspired for their children to migrate abroad felt that they could do so by taking on the Khalsa identity, learning the religious practices and texts, as well as Punjabi, and explore opportunities abroad as Granthis or Gyanis, since they could not invest in higher education in these countries. For other Sikh parents and students, the knowledge of Punjabi language was simply supplementary and did not hold any viable meaning. Now, the diverse social composition in the school has raised several challenges for both teachers and school managements, especially around subjects such as Punjabi and divinity and other identity-focused cultural activities of the schools. Sikh school managements hence face many dilemmas. How do they remain minority schools when they are forced to give admission to growing number of students from other religious backgrounds, as economically better off members of the community access different private schools for their children? Does the emphasis on Sikh identity and related activities pose a constraint if the middle and upper middle class Sikh families are to be attracted back to the schools? So this predicament is actually not entirely lost on those at the helm of these institutions. So in JVS, the first school that I discussed, the management was contemplating to shift to the international baccalaureate curriculum to bring these classes of Sikhs back. So also because of the complex intersections of class, identity, and the influence of the diaspora on students' opinions on their Sikh identity and their changing aspirations, Sikh managements will likely have to adopt multicultural administrative and pedagogical practices and reflect on the larger goals of what is rapidly changing context of these institutions. Though I did see some changes in pedagogy and practices, these are very slow paced, and the reality of classroom diversity, both in terms of Sikh identity and the rise in the number of students from other religious backgrounds, is yet to be institutionally dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yamini, for that fascinating insight into Sikh schools in Delhi. We have one question in chat. Let's give it another couple of minutes for people to think about questions, and we can kind of take it from there. But in the meantime, I could kind of read that question out if you wish. Are you able to read it, Yamini, or would you like me to read it out for you?
Okay, I can. Can you read it out? I eventually had to join from my phone. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
So I have one question. Let me just go back to, so I have one question from Manor Singh, which I've lost for some reason. I'll come back to Manor's when, Alex, maybe you could post that again because I can't see it here. But I have one from Prashara Singh here, who says, thanks, Yamini, for your presentation on Sikh schools in Delhi. I was wondering about the chain of Guru Harkrishan public schools in New Delhi, which has not become part of your research. Perhaps these public schools belong to the higher strata of Sikh society, while your focus was on Khalsa schools controlled by the Delhi Sikh Management Committee. But your analysis was an interesting one. So do you want to answer that? And I've got the other question from Manor now, and we can take that afterwards if you want to just answer this one.
More of a comment really, but thank you. So the schools were actually under the Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee and not the other one, like you said. And this is the main body that runs Guru Harkrishan Public Schools. The research was based on these schools only and not the Khalsa schools.
Got it. Thank you. So I'm just going to read out the question from Manor here, Manor Singh from the UK. He says, hi, Yamini. In the UK, we have state-funded faith schools operated by minority faith groups and faith organizations, such as Sikh trusts. These faith groups and faith organizations are understood to assert a level of power and control, quote unquote, over members of a minority or faith community through educational aims which ostensibly seek to limit pupils' thoughts and behavior within boundaries purportedly delineated by religion, culture, or tradition. Is this concern mirrored in conversations about Sikh schools in Delhi?
Thank you for the question. Yes, in a lot of ways, I mean, I did find these concerns, but they are not discussed per se. The level of power and control, I did briefly discuss it, even in terms of disciplining and punishment. And that itself is trying to assert some sense of control over students' sense of their identity, as well as even their bodies and sexuality. So by asking students to baptize, by telling them this is the good way, this is the right way, and this is the way to be. There was a recent controversy here where the one of the committees by the management was running this program in the schools, telling boys that they have to wear turban to be proper Sikhs, and that will, you'll stand out in the crowd if you do that. So that sense of power and control, by disciplining the bodies, by disciplining the way you behave, disciplining behavior itself is seen. But there are many other underlying issues in terms of, discussion, not really. But of course, when one enters the schools, these are quite explicit. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And you're welcome to follow up on these questions if you wish. This is to people who have submitted questions and also to people who have yet to submit. A third question, somewhat short. This is from Dr. Harminder Singh. Can you tell us a little bit more about the percentage of students of Sikh students in the Sikh schools? You mentioned a figure of 5%. Can you elaborate on that? And is that the same across the board?
No, not really across the board, but yes, the numbers are falling. So, like I said, the first school, JVS, it was considered the model branch of this management. One of the first schools that was started in Delhi, and both the teachers and the management, they viewed the fact that Sikhs in increasing numbers had left the school. So like I said, from approximately 3,000 to 3,500, there were only about 30% schools. And the management, when I conducted my research, they were planning to shift to international baccalaureate curriculum to get these classes of Sikhs back. Now, like I said, Sikh managements have also opened schools in areas with even little Sikh population. So one of these, this was AGS, the other school. But what had happened was that, so after 84, a lot of Sikhs moved from this neighborhood. In these schools, there were only 5%, but this was one of the largest schools in the area, and around 4,000 students in the school, but only 5%. And if you're asking that, is this like this in all other schools? Not really, but the numbers is surely falling in minority schools, specifically the Sikh schools. No branch, I can say for sure, no branch would have more than 50 to 40% of Sikh students. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I'm going to go on to Anneeth's question here, who says, thank you for your talk, Yamini. Sikh-Muslim tensions and relationalities also come up in pedagogical contexts in the US, but also can be rerouted through questions of solidarity, given the shared discriminations that Sikhs and Muslims experience here. Are you seeing anything similar in India?
Not really. Unfortunately, most of these issues are brushed, I would say, under the carpet. Like I said, nobody would discuss these. But in terms of pedagogy, yes, stories and these tensions, and these are there. I mean, like in the interviews, students were quite explicit and they explained in detail how they felt. but no, there was no discussion, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And also on solidarity, nothing like that.
Right. Thank you for that. Manor Singh from the UK has followed up with a second question, and he asks, Yamini, I observed that the development of faith schools belonging to non-Indigenous minority traditions and cultures in Britain has evoked or actually provoked questions about the inclusivity in two ways. Firstly, the exclusion of children not belonging to the Sikh faith, and secondly, the exclusion of children, Sikh children, from understanding their culture and tradition as a valid expression of secular Britishness. Again, do we see similar issues in India? You suggested that affluent Sikh parents are seeking a more secular education for their children. So do these children approach Sikh identity, or how do these children approach Sikh identity?
I'm not very sure how they approach their Sikh identity, because I did not interview those who were not in these schools. But from what I know briefly is, like I said, private tuitions or maybe going to gurdwaras nearby. The families in this case play a very important role in teaching them about their own religion and culture. How they approach the Sikh identity, I'm not sure, because I did not interview them.
Okay. One question from Radhika. Do students have a way of joking about the management's insistence on following a religious disciplinary style of behavior?
Yes, of course. Students have their own culture in school, and a lot of times they do not want to do this. They rebel. They rebel a lot. Some male students I met they had cut their hair but were wearing turbans. A lot of families, the fathers had cut their hair and were only wearing turban when they were visiting schools. So it was really, joke in the sense, yes. I mean, like I said, they had their own culture and their own way of following what they thought was maybe necessary, because nobody wants to be punished. But a lot of times, and in several ways, they were rebelling as well.
Okay. Any further questions? Happy to entertain them. We have a few more minutes before we close. I wondered whether you might say something more about, you use class as an important indicator here, but I didn't hear you, and I may be wrong, but I didn't hear you mentioning caste at all. Has that come into any of your work?
Yeah, so when I started the research, so caste was an important question in my, the initial questions with which I went to the schools. But in terms of the interviews, the students were not very well aware per se of caste, or as they had learned in schools. So I would get, whenever I would ask about caste, they gave a very simple answer that we don't know, or in Sikhism it is about, caste is not very important. Also in terms of schools and access to these schools, caste is not really important. So if we go by the point of accessibility, the schools are pretty open to admission of Sikh students. They reserve seats, 50% seats for Sikh students. So that is why later on, I decided to drop it, because it was not really then making it an important feature in my research.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have one question from Harjeet here. Thank you for a very informative presentation. I wanted to ask you to comment on how you are using the term normative in its application to Sikh minorities in light of power and discipline contexts of secularism and religious nationalism in post-1947 India. it seems to me that the use of normative could be made more complex across a comparative grid. Is that not the case?
Definitely. Normative, by normative, I mean the definition that SGPC and the management, I mean, they go by. This is the normative that I'm saying. I'm saying normative also based on what is mentioned in the school's vision book, and also across all spatial dimensions of the school, which is basically adhering to the Khalsa, conservative Khalsa identity and insistence on baptism. But otherwise, it is definitely very complex and comprises of these various features that make up this whole identity. And the second part, what you said, in light of power and discipline, context of secularism, religious nationalism. Definitely, I mean, these were part of my research, and these various shifts, secularism, post-independence, the coming up of minority rights in education, also 1984, they all have contributed to how we understand Sikh identity and the various shifts that have marked this whole debate on Sikh identity.
Okay. It's time for one last question if anybody wants to ask. Otherwise, I will probably bring the session to a close, and we're saving a little bit of time today, which is good because we can use it for a break later on. But any takers for a last question? Happy to entertain that. So I'm not seeing anything there at the moment. Otherwise, great. Let's bring this first session to a close. Oh, there's one that's just come in. So let me just take this last one from, again, from Dr. Harminder Singh. So he says, this was a great presentation. What do we know about the trajectory of the life of the lost generation, the ones who did not get an education?
Well, I have a paper on that I can share, but they did lose out. I mean, and they did not go back to schools at all. My earlier research specifically focused on female survivors of 84 who were in schools at the time of the riots. And well, we did, like it is said, we did lose an entire generation who eventually did not go back to schools. They had no means, and they suffered not just from lack of education, but also emotionally, psychologically, as well as their younger siblings. 30 years later, when I conducted the research, they were still in not really, the better shape of life, and still struggling to settle, as I would say. Lack of education, I mean, had contributed majorly to how their lives had panned out later.
Okay, I have one last question. Questions are slowly filtering in. Dr. Neelam has asked, he's wondering how 1984 is being taught in the Sikh schools in India, or more generally, both in regular school, Sikh schools, but also regular non-Sikh schools as well. Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, in terms of regular Sikh schools, so I conducted my research over a period of 18 months. I did ask, so there was hardly any mention of 84 within the schools, but most students knew about it from their families and not the schools. In terms of non-Sikh schools, some textbooks do mention it, but not in extreme detail. There are communal violence in general is discussed, and under which this is probably taught. But in Sikh schools, I'm not very sure. I think the idea is to maybe not directly talk to students about it. However, ironically, I mean, this has been, like I said, such a watershed movement that most students, even this young generation, they do know about it mostly from their families or grandmothers and grandparents.
Right. Thank you for that. We have a question coming in from the YouTube chat. It's from Kaur. So firstly, thank you for this wonderful talk. Could you please throw some more light on how teachers go about this rendering of value education? How can we get to know about it more?
Look, these are Sikh schools, so these are minority schools, so they do have the right to, in terms of appointment. So most of the teachers, they also, are participants that way in promoting this identity aspirations of the management, I would say. Pedagogy, as far as I observed in classrooms, yes, in everything, even in the core subjects and all, they often tend to bring up Sikhism, Sikh gurus, and everything. So it is very much linked to the pedagogy in schools, and I would say the teachers are, regular participants in promoting the agendas of the schools.
Okay. There was an interesting comment that came up from a couple of people who are suggesting that we should actually have a much longer session just on Sikh schools and in a comparative context. So we know that Sikh schools have been around in the UK, in Delhi, in Canada, etc., and also in Southeast Asia as well. It might be really interesting to get different presenters to present on this in a session dedicated just to this topic. It's seems to be a new and emerging topic that certainly Sikh Formations is publishing on this. Any thoughts on that, Yamini?
No, I think that would be wonderful. Different sites and also the influence of the diaspora, like I said. These schools, I recently read, even in Australia, the whole community contributed some millions of dollars, and a Sikh school is being set up. So obviously, this is going to be very interesting to do this in comparative sites and look at what are the different ways in which students understand their identity, and how do these, in fact, contribute to how we understand Sikh identity as well. So yes, definitely, that would be great.
Right. I'm just picking up one more message that this is from Herlene again. There's a Facebook message, actually, which asks, oh, here we go. If you could please elaborate on teachers in the management schools. Are they preferably Sikhs or from different communities?
Preferably Sikhs. Like I said, these schools are minority schools. So when one is officially categorized as a minority schools under various rules and regulations, this management has the last say in appointments, and they also reserve 50% seats for Sikh students. So yes, most teachers are Sikhs, but when it comes to senior teachers and all, I did interview some non-Sikh teachers as well. And in a way, not related to your question, but I can say that appointment of teachers and it has contributed probably to a lot of politics that we currently see in Sikh schools, because look, these managements are elected every 4 years, and every 4 years a new management comes, brings with it new politics, new teachers, new appointees, and that contributes to a lot of changes in the schools every few years. And teachers, yes, A lot of them, most of them, I would say, are Sikh teachers. Sometimes I would say they do not abide by rules in terms of appointment, but yes, Sikh teachers mostly.
Right. Well, it's coming up to 11:55, which is pretty much close to our allotted time. So I'm going to bring this first session to a close. My thanks to Dr. Yamini Aggarwal for bringing this very interesting topic to our attention. And I think it's something that, we're going to keep our eyes on as a research community. So thank you very much, Yamini, and good luck.
Thank you so much
with your future research on this.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Great. I think we can also switch. Alex, are we taking a minute or two for break or moving on to the second session?
We will be moving on to the second session from here with introductions.
Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Harjeet Grewal and our speaker, Dr. Radhika Chopra, to come on. And Harjeet, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Arvind. So I just wanted to also take a minute to thank Dr. Yamini Aggarwal. It was a fascinating presentation, and so many questions were coming to mind as we were listening. So really appreciate that. And I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Radhika Chopra, whose talk entitled Curating Divinity we'll be listening to shortly. Dr. Radhika Chopra, actually, I'll start by inviting you to turn on your screen so that we can have you join us here in the main frame. Dr. Chopra, can you turn on your screen? Is it on? So Dr. Chopra recently retired as a professor from the Department of Sociology at the University of Delhi in India. She's published 2 monographs, first entitled Amritsar 1984, A City Remembers, and Militant and Migrant is the second work, The Politics and Social History of Punjab, that dealt with militancy and its aftermath. Dr. Chopra has edited 5 books, most recently 2 books of photographs, Ways of Worship and Migrant Lives. She's published widely in peer-reviewed international journals and contributed chapters to edited volumes. She held the ICCR Chair of India Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. I pardon my pronunciation if that was incorrectly pronounced, and has been a Fulbright Fellow between 1995 and 96, and a Charles Wallace India Trust grantee at various points of time. She continues to work on the intersections of religion, politics, and visual cultures. And I'm actually really excited about that because I think we share an interest in visual culture as well. So it's kind of where our intellectual interests connect, Dr. Chopra. So with that, I will forward this screen over to Dr. Chopra, and we can listen to your talk, Curating. Go ahead, Dr. Chopra.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for inviting me to present some of my work, ongoing work on basically the city of Amritsar. And it's interesting to me that while Yamini spoke of a city and a moment in that city, the 1984 riots, I've moved to the other city where 1984 was also a momentous event, Amritsar. And in what sense is it that the aftermath of 1984 continues to linger, shape, and in a way govern the kind of discourses and discussions in Amritsar and in Punjab around what 1984 is about and the persons who inhabited that landscape of 1984. So today, I'm going to actually look at, in my earlier work, I've looked quite closely at the Darbar Sahib, where 1984 was the event which literally transformed that space. So much happened within the Darbar Sahib, transforming it and bringing up new forms of remembrance and practices of memory, of remembrance, of forgetting within Darbar Sahib. One of those spaces was, of course, the Kendri Sikh Ghar, the Central Sikh Museum, which again is something I've written about, and the memorials that it created, generated. Today, I want to speak about some of the ideas that occurred to me while I was looking closely at the museum and its curations. Because one of the things about museum curators is how attentive curators are to the voice of things, how closely they literally look at the issue of sacred art and sacred objects as affective objects, as objects that arouse emotion, that create connection, that produce relationships. And it's precisely because it's not just the object itself, but curators also recognize that the kind of value that communities who have a relationship with those objects, the kind of value they place on these sacred objects. So a lot of the techniques of curation and of exhibition actually shape how sacred art is literally dealt with. So how sacred objects are spotlighted, elevated, spaced and placed and so on, has a lot to do with creating an aura that lifts this sacred object out of the domain of ordinary things and puts it into its own domain to create a sense of what is sacred and how this object itself is sacred. It's interesting to me that the word curator, etymologically speaking, has its root in the idea of care, in the Latin idea of cura, to care. And the curator then is a caregiver, if you will, with a pastoral responsibility towards sacred art, as well as interpreting how that sacred art is to be displayed, exhibited, and treated. The Kendri Sikh Ghar, the Central Sikh Museum, the portraits and paintings of the lives of gurus and martyrs are in fact treated as they are sacred objects. They're treated like mazbi tasvirans, and they are actually treated as objects to be venerated, not just viewed. So it's an exhibition, it's an exhibit in a museum, but it is also part of a sort of religious relationship that is established. So I'm going to ask Alex, who's much more proficient at this than I am, to display the first slide, if you would, please, the first photograph. Yes. So this is a photograph that I've taken in the museum, and as you can see, these are paintings of events in the lives of gurus and of martyrs, and people, in looking at them, sort of stand before these objects, with before these paintings, before these portraits, with their heads covered, with bare feet, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the post-1984 and the destruction and the military Operation Blue Star that happened in the Darbar Sahib, a special gallery and exhibition space was created. Again, something which I've written a great deal about before. So all I'm going to do is to just show you the photograph of that room, if you will. Alex, if I could request you to go to the next one. So this is the gallery space of 1984 as I first photographed it in 2007. Again, this is at a moment when in June 2007, when the Operation Blue Star commemoration of the destruction, in a sense, is remembered and mourned. And one of the things that people do is to visit the museum, look with a great deal of attention at the paintings. Not all the paintings are of 1984. In fact, there is a whole row of people, of portraits of people who were involved in the Punjabi Suba movement, which preceded the Khalistan movement. However, the museum is not the only space where representations of martyrs and gurus are seen. The shrine bazaars, the bazaars that surround the Darbar Sahib, and indeed other shrines in Amritsar and elsewhere, martyr images abound. And this proliferation of images of martyrs in the bazaar spaces raise a series of different kinds of questions. The first, what sense of martyrdom is being evoked beyond the confines of the museum and the shrine? What boundaries are crossed by the images of gurus and martyrs when they literally, as it were, step out of the precincts of sacred space into the more profane, mundane, ordinary spaces of the bazaar? So what happens to martyrs in the bazaar? What particular intersections of the political with the divine are discernible in the bazaar appearances of martyrs and of gurus? I'm going to primarily focus on martyrs. Does the fact that the bazaar is contiguous, is not just proximate, but literally surrounds the shrine, does it mean that there's this kind of synchronized view, synchronized cura and interpretation of these images in the bazaar, which synchronizes with the interpretation of curation of martyrs in the Shrine Museum? Or does the bazaar offer a very distinct point of view on martyrdom? So the point that I want to really discuss in this paper is the focus of my paper is on curating martyrs in the bazaar, curating martyrdom and martyrs in the bazaar. Now, it's clear that the museum in the shrine and the shops in the bazaar share a very key element. The sense of care of cura towards religious artifacts and mazbi tasveeran. They recognize, both shops and museum recognize the affective quality of these mazbi tasveeran, of this religious paintings and portraits. But in doing so, what's interesting in the difference between the shop curation, the bazaar curation, and the museum curation is that while in the museum, the recognition of the affective quality can be both seen and displayed and left there, in the bazaar, the portraits literally have to be designed to act and attract the sense of sacred to them. So there's a sense in which religious souvenirs are active in a different way, that they are literally created with a sense that they have to be placed in a vis-a-vis with different kinds of objects, particularly commodities, because the religious artifacts are also souvenirs in a bazaar landscape. And there are commodities that need to compete with other commodities. So access to a pilgrim's purse cannot really be assumed by a religious artifact in the bazaar. A souvenir literally needs to catch a pilgrim's attention because they are in competition with other goods for the pilgrim's purse. Of course, spotlighting and placement and so on of sacred souvenirs is imperative. And the techniques of curation that we see in the museum are also on display, if you will, are also evident in bazaar curations, exhibition displays, elevations, spotlighting or lighting, let me say. But in addition, then, there are the requirements of commerce. So there's a special packaging, for example, that needs to display the souvenir in a particular way. There are different kinds of lighting that needs to be taken on board. For example, the use of batteries to light up halos or to make the heart of the divine glow in a particular way, or mechanized kinds of movements of hands that come up and bless the passerbys and so on. So there's a whole deliberate set of techniques that are also needing to be adopted, where the arrangements of where the question of what is a sacred souvenir and why is it sacred and how is that sacred quality that conveyed actually comes into play in the shop window exhibition. So shopkeepers' curation, in a sense, are quite evident through the objects. And it seems to me that what we are seeing in thinking through the idea of bazaar curation is not only that objects are affective and objects speak and reach and are transformative, but that shopkeeper curators speak through their objects and through the displays and transactions of these objects. Like in the museum, martyrs are a very large presence in the bazaars, and certainly in the bazaars of Amritsar, martyrs abound. One of the uber martyrs in the souvenir universe is Baba Deep Singh. In the souvenir, he is literally positioned as an exemplar martyr, and his posters and little figurines and so on are widely available. If I could just go to the third photograph, Alex, please. I came across, yes, thank you. I came across a pavement seller in the early years of my research in 2000. This is in 2011, where this pavement seller was selling posters of gurus and martyrs. And here you see the gurus and Baba Deep Singh are displayed. And what he had to tell me in the course of an interview is that he always positions, is that in the placement and spotlighting, if you will, of gurus and martyrs, he always places them above the heads of all other posters. But he has a whole series of posters to sell, including posters of wrestlers and singers, popular singers, and of course the ubiquitous naked baby boy. Now these visual displays, the visual cura of the pavement seller, led me to consider the idea of not only bazaar curation, but think about the curation of the images of two other martyrs, other than who are also present and became more and more present, if you will, post 1984. These two martyrs. So while Baba Deep Singh was always there, two other martyrs began emerging in the post-1984 period. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala and Bhagat Singh. Now, Bhagat Singh's souvenirs, a bit like the man himself, have a rather checkered history. The early commercial failure of Bhindranwale's souvenirs actually reflect the kind of sense of unease that his memory evoked, and the kind of sense of discomfort that people felt in remembering him. People in Amritsar whom I spoke to over a long period of almost 10 years, when recounting the displays of Bhindranwale, did not do so readily or as easily as, let us say, they may have spoken of Baba Deep Singh or indeed, of course, of the Gurus. So it seems to me that the remembrance of his legacy has a kind of ambiguous tenor to it, and part of it is because there is a people are unsure what to make of his occupation of the spaces of the Darbar Sahib. What to make of some of the practices that in the 2-year period that he was in the precincts of the Darbar Sahib, the kinds of practices that were that happened within the sacred shrine, and the remembrance of course, his subsequent death in 1984 during Operation Blue Star was followed by the embargo by the Indian state on any form of remembrance rituals, particularly not only about what happened, but about Bhindranwale himself. So there's a lot of reasons why the Bhindranwale posters and souvenir art was really unavailable, if you will, in the immediate aftermath of 1984. The one place in which Bhindranwale souvenirs were evident and in fact always on display was the Taksali Pustak Bhandar, a bookshop run by the Damdami Taksal, of which he was head for a brief period of time. Now, it's an interesting bookshop in the sense that it displays cassettes and pamphlets and books associated of his speeches or written about him and so on. But it's also sort of set back a little bit or segregated from other kind of shops in the street, bazaar streets, because it's glass fronted. And so there's a kind of distinction between the shop and pavement. So he's not like the pavement bookseller at all. Sorry, poster seller. The shop signage of the Taksali Bhandar prominently displayed Bhindranwale's photographed portrait, and it was always there whenever you passed it. So this was one of the places between 2007, when I began doing my close field work of that area around the shrine, around the Darbar Sahib, to 2013, when things started changing. Now, one of the things that's changed dramatically was that in 2011, a portrait of Bhindranwale was hung in the museum itself. A lot of controversy surrounded the portrait, a lot of controversy surrounded the installation of the portrait, what the portrait eventually looked like and how it was treated eventually, etc., has a lot of discourse around it. Again, something which I've written about, and I'll only say that it was certainly a controversial image, and it was also one that was met with a great deal of fascination. So both things went side by side, the unease, the controversy, and the fascination. In the period that post the installation of the portrait in the museum, within the shrine, one other shop, other than the Taksali Pustak Bhandar, began displaying Bhindranwale souvenirs. This shop was in the main street that led from the Fountain Chowk now, which has Maharaja Ranjit Singh's many-tiered the statues on it at that Fountain Chowk, which the street that leads then to the Darbar Sahib, to the clock gateway. And in that street was this one, which I'm going to just call the main street shop. Here, in its very prime location, it started hanging small portraits of Bhindranwale with some of his sayings below each of these little images. They were small, but they were very prominently displayed. And walking by the shop, it was almost as though Bhindranwale was at eye level and looked the passerbys in their eyes, straight at them. However, the Main Street shop literally incorporated the sale of Bhindranwale as object with other familiar souvenirs and goods. So unlike the Taksali bookshop, unlike the Taksali Pustak Bhandar, which concentrated solely and wholly on Bhindranwale memorabilia and souvenir, this Main Street shop was sort of rather a sort of commercial enterprise. And while it seemed to me that the Taksali shop, the sale of souvenirs, was almost secondary, the whole point was just to be there. The Main Street shop positioned its goods, including the Bhindranwale souvenirs, in the competitive spirit of the marketplace to attract all comers. But it also seemed to me that the Taksali shop and the Main Street shop were in a kind of visual conversation about the sense of cura they had with each other, where on the one hand, over the years from 2007 to 2013, which is when the Main Street shop started up, so to speak, the images of Bhindranwale and the shop signage of Taksali bookshop started to fade, to actually not be replenished with newer photographs and more colorful images. The Main Street shop started enlarging the number of images they had. In fact, from the little portraits, they began to have larger posters. Many of them then became framed and put up very prominently on display. So Alex, could I request you for the next slide, please? Yeah. So this is the kind of display that exists in this Main Street shop, and you have to pass by this shop and you have to see the things on display, and they literally grab your attention. They are literally designed to act. However, given that the presence of particular martyrs was always somehow not, not a sort of resolved issue at all. Bhindranwale himself is somebody, surrounded by controversy of on all sides. This kind of display was met with a counter display, if you will, a counter exhibition and a counter cura. Right almost diagonally across from the Main Street shop is another one. And this other one, quite interestingly, has a very elongated frontage. It's very advantageous, therefore, because all its souvenir goods then are, you can see them very clearly. So I'll go to the next slide, if you will, if I could possibly. So this is that shop. It's completely open fronted. It's literally on the pavement. It's not quite a pavement cellar, but it's as close to the pavement as you could possibly get. Literally on the street, just off the pavement. And all its souvenir goods, you can see, orient themselves to the Darbar Sahib. There are Guru portraits, Martyr portraits, and so on. But one key commodity, one key souvenir, and one key martyr that emerged in this shop, and in this shop alone, after 2013, was the portrait of Bhagat Singh. Now, it's a very interesting portrait because, sartorially speaking, it's quite striking that here the Bhagat Singh presentation, the Bhagat Singh image, is of Bhagat Singh dressed in his Kesari pag and with a revolver sometimes in his hand. Mind you, this was a very actively sold souvenir. So whenever I passed by, there would often be a change of the souvenir image itself. Sometimes Bhagat Singh's portrait had the revolver tucked into his waistband, sometimes in his hand, but always present very prominently in the picture house, which is what I'm going to call this shop. It seemed to me to suggest, Bhagat Singh and Bhindranwale seemed to suggest two publics. One where Bhagat Singh was, I mean, as you see in the next image in particular, which is a bit larger. So Alex, if we could just go to the second image. As you see here, it's almost as though Bhagat Singh is stepping out into the street to join the throng headed towards the Darbar Sahib. This shop itself is quite close to, is in line with the other shops that are heading towards the Darbar Sahib clock tower entrance. And it seemed to me that one of the things that was happening here was a kind of contest between martyrs, a kind of contest between the primacy of what is it that needs to be remembered and what sense of martyrdom are we looking at here. It seems to me that the materiality of the bazaar curation is extremely responsive to the politics of martyrdom that is taking place both within the Darbar Sahib and within the Sikh imaginary. So the visual politics in the museum is something that the bazaar curation also responds to. It does not only replicate it, but it certainly is responsive to it. There is a sense in which the viewpoints of shopkeepers are on display through the exhibition and the choices they make in the arrangement of the artifacts, as well as the choice of things that they do sell in their particular shops. And it seems to me it is reflective. It's a very reflective and thought out process. The souvenir art that is placed in some of these shops is just not an ad hoc miscellany of things, of souvenirs as a sort of hodgepodge collection of things, but something that is thought through, that has a sense of curation in it. It seems to me that Bhindranwale and Bhagat literally converse with each other across the street in continuing the story of martyrdom. And in positioning themselves as intrinsic to the creation of religious feeling through their ritual goods, the shopkeepers are offering a point of view upon the kind of issues that were raised about particular martyrs, about the creation of particular images that came to occupy the museum. It was a kind of commentary, I won't call it criticism, but it was certainly a commentary on the events within the Darbar Sahib and the exhibitions and the displays of images and portraits within the museum itself. The commentary was a kind of, was not overt. It was muffled at one level, but it certainly spoke through objects like these Masbi tasveera of martyrs. I think it countered, if you will, the kind of martyrdom, the hegemonies of particular martyrdom discourses that were being positioned within the Darbar Sahib, within the, not Darbar Sahib, but the Kendri Sikh Ajaib Khat, the Central Sikh Museum. And it seems to me that the insertion of bazaar curation into the conceptual congregational community and the interpretation of martyrdom is a way in which the shopkeepers literally conferred upon themselves the right to speak about the divine through their ordinary goods, through their ordinary souvenirs. So in a sense, this paper is really about honoring what Rancière calls honoring the commonplace, of paying attention to the ordinary, shifting the focus from the uber persona, if you of the big men and their interpretations of what should matter and how it should matter and what we should remember, to other ways of looking and seeing and focusing, and a different set of debates that are being generated through the kind of bazaar curation that I've tried to talk about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra, for that fascinating talk. I think I'll also, like Arvind did, give a few minutes and encourage, just a reminder again, if anyone wants to add their questions to the chat, this is the time to do so, please. I'm just going to check and see what we have here. All right, so the first question we have is from your co-presenter, so I'll start with that. Dr. Jyotsna Singh said, fascinating talk, Radhika, bizarre curation of the martyrs, make the martyrs speak, as you say. To what extent did they engage with history? Did they provide historical knowledge? And also any reflections on different engagements with history in the museum and in the bazaar?
Should I take that question now?
Yeah, please, yes. Why don't you respond to that, and I'll collect the other ones while you're speaking.
Okay, okay. Well, I think the point of how do they engage with history and provide historical knowledge. One of the interesting things about looking through visual art and sacred art is the way that history itself gets reconstructed and gets constructed and reconstructed in the process of literally envisioning what is history. So it seems to me that in many senses, the conflation of history, of myth, of I won't even call it myth, because in a sense, that is how it is presented as history. It is not sort of thought of as non-historical, it is thought of as events that happened, and this is how they are to be, this is how they are narrated. But I think a lot has to do with how they are also positioned as what is important to remember. So it seems to me that what the museum and what the souvenir portraitures and paintings are doing is to position what is the event and what sets of persons are important to remember and which can be laid to rest or gently forgotten. So in a sense, what we are seeing as history is a very active process of moving, of mobility, of remembrance that we have before us. In a sense, history is not a thing which is fixed and given, though at the moment, at any moment of time when it is discussed, it is presented as if it is fixed, as if this is the given, as if this is indeed the historical account that must be remembered. But history itself, as we know, is such a contentious field. It's always open to different kinds of interpretations. And which is why it's interesting to see the museum curation of historical persona and bazaar curation of historical persona as not always in synchrony one with the other. So yes, there is a reflection on different engagements of history in the museum and in the bazaar, I would say.
Great, thank you for that. In relation to that, actually, before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to maybe prod a little bit more in regards to the question of the historical. So as I was listening to you speak, I was noticing that you were kind of articulating another movement of historical time, and that's the kind of way that the memory and the images and the portraits of figures from 1984 and earlier, in terms of the question of martyrs, was being incorporated into museum space, but then also kind of there was some moments you mentioned, like the 2013 moment where the Bhagat Singh portrait enters, where there seems to be another history, kind of a history of, that kind of what Rancière was saying, kind of paying attention to the common or the mundane. So could you maybe comment on that as well? Like maybe give some, is there more, if you think about it now, perhaps, or if you're already familiar with some of the contexts and the changes that were going on and enabling the bazaar or the street to respond to some of what was going on in the sacred space, in terms of kind of these specific moments where we start to see these images. And I remember when I was doing my field work in 2013 with the opening of the shrine inside Darbar Sahib, and there was a portrait of, and there was a few days where there was a question. I remember because we were in the Darbar Sahib precincts and doing archival work, but there was a few days where the talk on the street was kind of like, will there or will there not be some recognition of Pindramala in that space? And surely there was, and then there was a lot of furor around that on that day, and you could see how that was contested. So kind of there's a history of this contestation, I think, that you're kind of drawing out, and I invite you to maybe speak a little bit more about that in the specific moments that you mentioned in your paper.
Right. Okay. So let me just pay attention to two aspects of your question. One is this, the emergence of Bhagat Singh portraits, because I found it really interesting that what is it that suddenly made Bhagat Singh emerge after 2013? The Bhagat Singh souvenirs were not so important. Even more important than the painted art, the painted portraits and the paintings of Bhagat Singh were T-shirts, which began being sold a little later, which said, it looks like I have to return, and things like that were printed on the T-shirts. And it was interesting to me that this was the street, in a sense, that was chosen, if you will, to display these particular souvenirs. What sense of history, what sense of pasts, what kind of historical knowledge was being evoked? Because what's really peculiar is, why is Bhagat Singh being remembered here? People sort of immediately associated with it with Jallianwala Bagh. But that's peculiar, because actually historical fact, if we are looking at history per se as bald fact, then Bhagat Singh was only 11 years old when Jallianwala Bagh happened in 1990. He was not a player in Jallianwala Bagh. But it's what Jallianwala Bagh represents as the nationalist monument, as a monument of the nation, as a moment through which the nationalist movement emerged, as one of the beginnings, if you will, of the nationalist movement. That became encapsulated within Jallianwala Bagh, and therefore the association of Bhagat Singh with that kind of secular nationalism, countering what was positioned. I mean, what is it that Bhagat Singh looks towards? He looks towards another martyr who is associated with a very critical movement as well, a critical movement where, spatially speaking, that was the space in which that movement was best articulated. Not only, that was not the only theater of that movement, but certainly one where, visually speaking, it had its most exuberant expressions. And in that sense, the portraiture of Bhindranwale, dressed in this very overtly, sartorially speaking, overtly religious garb of a choga, and with the barsha, this arrow in his hand, and so on, replicating the portrait, that very controversial portrait in the museum. And Bhagat Singh with his revolver and almost military-like uniform, the tucked-in shirt and the neatly tied kesari turban and so on, really does develop this sense of what sense of history should we be remembering? Which past is valuable? Which past speaks? And through what image is that speech being articulated, being heard? So it seems to me that in some senses, street art had a lot to do with what was going on in the museum, but I might also add vice versa. Because I don't think the Yadgar, the memorial, could have come up in the way that it did without the kinds of pressures that the souvenir universe had already unleashed in the general population. Images, as we know, well prior to the establishment of the Yadgar in 2013, it began in the first stones, bricks were laid in 2012, and within a year, the Yadgar was up, the memorial to the Shaheeds, in which, of course, Bhindranwale is mentioned as a legend on the gateway of the entryway. There were already these little stickers of Bhindranwale that would come up on the backs of cabs, on motorcycles, on rickshaws, and things like that. So Bhindranwale suddenly became this presence, in a small presence, but a very proliferating presence on the souvenir landscape. And it's almost as though Bhindranwale's memory pushed at the Darbar Sahib's precincts to let him back in. So it seems to me that there's this constant sort of back and forth between the visual imageries that go in and out of these two spaces, the sacred and the secular. And it's in that sense that I talk about bazaar curation specifically as the way in which the religious souvenirs sold in the bazaar are thought of by the shopkeepers not just as ordinary things, but things of special value. They say something special. They're also kept separately, packaged differently, and so on.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, there's just so much to kind of unpack, even with what you just mentioned, secular and sacred, but also kind of the competing nationalisms and things like that that are going on, especially in Punjab, but also how these kind of come into diasporic spaces and things like that. It just kind of, I think the benefit of the visual cultural analysis is really kind of brought to the fore in these types of moments where, there's a very contestation over what historical narrative is, and, the policing of, different states and nation states to regulate, everyday people and things like that as well. So I just found it really fascinating. I'll move on. I think you and I could talk for hours about this. It reminds me of my own work on visual culture and the memory of these moments and how they get recoded into the past. Actually, the visualization of the past is important to break that policing of these types of memorialations. But Manohar Singh asks, Radhika, firstly, in order for Sikh religious art to be commercial, do we see a depoliticization, perhaps via a different aesthetic to what is seen in the Gurdwara Museum? And the second question is, does the presence of portraits in Sikh martyrs indicate a political ambivalence or a disarming of Sikh political agency? So I think that's related to some of the comments I just made as well. Do you see that?
I'm sorry, your voice was slightly breaking up. So is the question written anywhere? Maybe I can quickly read it.
Yeah, you should be able to see it in the chat. It's if you just scroll up. Manor posted it at 10:26. Oh, okay. I can read it again if you'd like. Am I clear if I speak more closely to my mic?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so
Okay,
in
I
order,
get it.
you
Okay,
see it? Okay, great.
in order for Sikh religious art to be commercial. Okay, okay. Well, it's interesting to think about it as a different aesthetic. I think it's not that there's a different aesthetic as much as there is a different material form. So if in the museum, the Masjid Tasveera or the Sikh religious art appears more as portraiture or in a sense as paintings and portraiture, in the bazaar curation, in the context of the bazaar, it appears in many different forms. It could be emblazoned on T-shirts or on bags or on poster art. It's also placed differently. I mean, it could be on a pavement and not sort of elevated up on a wall, for example. So there's a sense in which I think the materiality of the bazaar has something to say about, if not the aesthetic form, as much as the form itself. In what is it that, how is it that it appears and conveys the sense of the sacred, the sense of the sacred persona. Okay, so did I get the whole question, or am I kind of missing? I'm sorry.
I think that was good. Maybe if you can speak more to like the political ambivalence and disarming of Sikh political agency. That's the second question that Manor was asking.
Yes. I don't know about. Okay, so again, this question of the disarming of Sikh political agency, I would certainly say that in the period, in the immediate aftermath of 1984, the kinds of embargoes on what was possible to present and what was possible to literally be seen and shown was very closely regulated. So I would say that there was a way in which political agency was literally sucked away, was not permissible, was not allowable. But it did not remain there. I think slowly and over time, and not so slowly either, it's not just through resistance, it's also been through the way there's been a kind of loosening of particular kinds of restrictions around a way in which the Darbar Sahib itself has sort of cast a canopy of sacredness over the bazaar and allowed a certain kind of discourse to emerge, allowed a sort of visual discourse, if you will, to emerge, in which, of course, there are these other controversies, not all of them resolved. So I think, in fact, the souvenir universe shows us a very active Sikh agency at play, a political agency at play. And I think the fact that it is not single-centered, that the fact that it is not hegemonically controlled either by the state or it seems to be by the clerics, that itself shows us the kind of sense of argument, commentary, resistance, and agreement, all going together, all interlocked between ordinary bazari log and the more pancha hua log of the Darbar Sahib, the clerics and others who control, who do, in a sense, control memory and history, or try to.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, that's definitely the case. And it again reminds me of even current contexts and kind of the questioning of both of those types of power. The clerical power is being questioned even today quite often in the kind of popular street kind of discourse on what is going on in contemporary events. So moving on, I think I'm going to jump around a few questions here. I wanted to just, there was a comment, I think just connected to Manohar's, Dr. Lou Fennick mentioned great talk. He's bringing up Udham Singh here. So Udham Singh is far more intimately associated with Amritsar and Jallianwala Bagh, and actually considered Bhagat Singh his guru. Yeah. Did you find any such commodities of Udham Singh? And if so, how are these positioned?
So The short answer, no. But no, in fact, that absence is so interesting to me. That in fact, Jallianwala Bagh, so much more closely associated with Udham Singh. In fact, Udham Singh's statue is sort of rather far away from this street and is not part of bazaar art really at all. It's there. I mean, Udham Singh's portraiture is there in the Jallianwala Museum, but it's not out on the street, literally and metaphorically speaking. So what is it about Bhagat Singh? What is it about Bhagat Singh that encapsulates an idea that manages, if you will, or tries to offer a challenge to the other martyr, the other modern martyr, Bhindranwale? So it's an interesting dialogue that is happening there, and it's an interesting absence, it seems to me, that Udham Singh, who was indeed the historical figure of Jallianwala Bagh, where Jallianwala Bagh is, as you yourself have mentioned to me in an earlier correspondence, so close, so much closer to the Darbar Sahib. Why is it that Udham Singh is an absence? Well, it seems to me that it's Bhagat Singh and his short life and his, his play with Sikhism and his adoption of these Sikh forms, his imprisonment and so on, that seem to capture imagination. And it is Bhagat Singh whose image and portrait appears much more systematically, almost, in state art, in state-produced art. So, for example, on posters of blood donation camps for the nation, Blood for the Nation, it's Bhagat Singh's portrait that appears there. It's Bhagat Singh's face. So it's an important way in which it seems to me that an idea of a militant leader, of a militant martyr, is being confronted by another form of permissible militancy, of a militancy that has been absorbed into the nation state and is much more central to the ideas of the emergence of a nation state. Mind you, Bhagat Singh wouldn't have had a long life today in 2021 at all.
And I think that also kind of, you're speaking about images and what the violence represents. I think Udham Singh, often is in kind of Gadri Baba or Inqalabi spaces as well. And so again, that kind of revolutionary violence, which maybe hasn't quite been brought under control of the nationalist narrative as much, kind of keeping it outside. Very interesting. I'm going to continue down the political train here. Kamul Abdi asks, can we connect these images of Sant Bhindranwala and Bhagat Singh to a certain vacuum in the Punjab political contemporary scenario, where the search of an ideal leader continues amongst the youth? And I wanted to kind of just add to this one as well. You kind of mentioned that there was a lag almost, that people, you began by saying that people didn't know and felt uncomfortable in your interviews about, what this representation symbolized or meant. Do you think that as things move into the bazaar, there's kind of a coming to terms and conversations and dialogue that are, beyond what's the visual representation are, but kind of come into these representations and represent some of this political contemporary, kind of mix?
Yeah, Kumar, thank you very much. I think that is the souvenir universe and the dialogues produced by it a way in which a contemporary absence of leadership or a sort of contemporary critique of current leadership is being offered? So it's not only about these two early martyrs, but really about what's happening now, or the sense of lack of the leader now that is being commented on. It's possible. I'm afraid I don't know enough about it, and I can't say enough about it. other than one small fact, which everybody comments on, almost relentlessly, it seems to me. The adoption of the style of pug, the color and style of pug by the AAP leader, Man, in contesting the polls, adopting the style of pug that Bhagat Singh wore. I think I think in trying to sort of evoke that legacy, in trying to make that connection and that lineage, it's people also didn't take that too seriously. I think there's a sense in which if there is a sense of lack, if there is a feeling of if there is a feeling that there aren't any great leaders anymore, and that's why we look to these other more giant martyrs and leaders. I think the difference really is that the current political leaders aren't looked upon as real martyrs, as ideal martyrs, that they would not, in fact, sacrifice for the nation or for their belief, unlike martyrs who Vindranwale, for whatever the critiques and the disquiet around his memory, there is a sense that he was certainly somebody committed to a point of view and a faith. So there's no doubt on that one, I think. What he represents, yes, there is disquiet and discomfort. How should he be remembered? Yes, there is a sense of unease, but it doesn't seem to me that there's a question that he was a towering leader. That's not being questioned, I think. It's precisely because he was so powerful, because he was that towering leader, because he managed to garner so much popular opinion. That's what makes people feel a sense of discomfort as well. Let's not face it. Do we still believe that point of view?
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to shift gears here. Harminder Singh was asking, do you think that this way Sikh souvenirs are curated is very different from Hindu, Christian, or Muslim souvenirs? There must be bazaars outside Hindu temples and Christian churches. So have you noticed anything in terms of how these are presented in other spaces, and maybe figures and portraits amongst different communities?
That's a fascinating question. I wish I had 1 hour to answer it. Very swiftly, though, let me just say it's very interesting to me that actually there is a sense in which what souvenir art manages to do, and what bazaar aesthetics, if you will, and the bazaar form manages to do, is borrow, is to break the frame and move back and forth between different kinds of things that are popular around one figure and adopt them into the figure of a martyr or a person of another faith. So it's very interesting to me to see how in Amritsar bazaars, Christ, Ravidas, the Peers, and the gurus are represented in a astonishingly, in a sort of simulacrum similarity almost. It's not just the beard and the halo, it's also the positioning of the hand. If you see, so many of the souvenir portraits will have this raised hand as though blessing the passerby and the person who will comment. The little sort of group of flowers that are placed at the feet of many of these painted figures or these printed portraits and so on. There's a striking similarity of borrowings that go across, that literally move from one frame to another frame. So yes, of course, there is distinction because they are quite immediately recognizable as belonging to different faiths, but there are also quite interesting composite posters that frame a whole series of people in one poster frame. And I've actually written about that quite extensively in one of the chapters of my book, Amritsar 1984, because it was so striking to me that within this one poster, there were 4 boxes that represented, in a way, one peer, but within that peer's congregation or silsila, if you will, there were the figures of other faiths, important recognizable figures of other faiths who were all participating, if you will, in the reverence or divinity, in the aura of that peer. So yes, there's distinction, but there's also a back and forth between visual back and forth. And that is exactly what makes visual ethnography so interesting about sacred art. You can see that sense of borrowing. And it isn't only between signatures of the divine, it's also between ordinary things. So for example, and most delightfully in a sense, is the way that balloons are used. So when certain divine portraits or the thresholds of shrines are, made segregated, they're actually decorated balloons. Is it a birthday party? Is it a shrine? Is it a inaugural moment? What is it? Who borrows? Who came first? Who cares? I mean, this is the interesting thing about visual art, it seems to me, how that borrowing is constant.
Great. I think we're at time here. So I just want really quickly, you just mentioned the ethnographic, and Dr. Nicola Mooney asked the last question. So just hopefully if you can just maybe in 30 seconds or a minute answer it pertaining to the ethnographic. And so she asks, and I apologize, Dr. Mooney, for truncating this a little bit, but about the visual culture, the broader project of the visual culture of the martyrs. Are you placing this in a larger ethnographic context, such as including conversations with the curators, visitors, customers, etc.? So is there conversations along that side in part of what you're considering, or will there be?
Yes, I did have fairly extensive conversations with, because I began my work in the museum, and the first set of people I did interview and sort of began talking to were people who visited, so visitors to the museum. And then the sevadars who were looking after the museum. And then those, in a sense, it was very hard to determine who curated the exhibitions in the Ajaib Ghar inside the Darbar Sahib. But because there were lots of different points of view and lots of different conflicting persons who said, they had done different kinds of things there. But yes, I have certainly had fairly detailed interviews with a whole slew of people, both inside the sacred complex as well as beyond it. Yes.
Great, thank you.
One of the things that I'm working on, sorry to take just this extra half moment, one of the things that I am working on in great detail now are the frescoes in the Baba Atal. So as another form of visual art, and what is this Janam Saki, the painted Janam Saki, the fresco.
Great, thank you. That was a very vibrant discussion, lots of different questions. So again, a quick apology to Dr. Gurharpal Singh. We won't be able to get to your question, but perhaps we can entertain it in the discussion following. We are going to be moving on to the next presentation. And before we go to that, I'll just quickly ask Alex, are we going to be having a break now, or how are we going to proceed, Alex?
We'll be having a brief 5-minute break and then be returning for the next presentation.
All right, great. So I guess we'll proceed with the break, and then after that, we'll go on with the next presentation, which Dr. Anneeth Kaur Hundle will be introducing.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I hope you had a chance to get a refreshment and some fresh air, maybe. My name is Anneeth Hundle, and I'm Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Chair of Sikh Studies at the University of California, Irvine. I'm also affiliated faculty with Asian American Studies and Religious Studies. And I'm really happy to host our last session today. Before I begin, I wanted to thank Dr. Aggarwal and Professor Chopra for their fascinating papers and really important contributions to the growth of Sikh and Punjab studies. And certainly the discussions that are emerging from these webinars are feeding into graduate student work and the future of the field. So this is very exciting. I also want to thank Alex and the whole Sikh Formations team for their work on today's webinar. So moving forward, I want to introduce Jyotsna, Professor Jyotsna Singh to our webinar. She's professor in the Department of English at Michigan State University. Her research interests include early modern literature and culture, Shakespeare, post-colonial theory, race and gender studies, colonial history, and travel writing. She's also published widely. Her selected book publications include the monographs, Colonial Narratives, Cultural Dialogues, Discoveries of India in the Languages of Colonialism, and Shakespeare and Post-Colonial Theory. She also has an edited book called A Companion to the Global Renaissance, Literature and Culture in the Era of Expansion, and a co-edited volume called The Post-Colonial World. Professor Singh has had visiting fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library, Queen Mary University of London, and most recently, St. Catherine's College at Oxford University. Her talk today is the beginning of an exciting new book project tentatively entitled The Making of Chandigarh, Architecture, History, and Cultural Memory. So without further ado, she will begin her paper, Chandigarh, a City in Search of an Identity, Dreams and Visions of Early Settlers.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And I would like to start by thanking Arvind for inviting me. The Sikh Studies in University of Michigan, our sort of neighbor school, is doing amazing things. And I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to the papers I just heard by both the speakers. And I want to especially sort of thank Radhika, because our papers, I think, are kind of speaking to each other about Amritsar and Chandigarh, sort of different cities, an ancient city and a new city. And I have learned a lot from you. I'd like to thank Alex Prosser, who was our magician, who's handled all the tech stuff and got us here at this point. So thank you, Alex, and for all my many annoying emails, answering them so graciously. I'd also like to thank my friend Ladan Naesh, who's not here today, but who will listen to it in Paris. And we sort of jointly discovered all the Corbusier sites to find out, where he lived and his work and his dreams of Chandigarh. I'd also like to sort of apologize or, give a disclaimer that my talk is very, very germinal. What we heard today were polished research papers. This is a completely new journey for me. In many ways, it's a personal journey. It's about, as Radhika was raising, how memories are curated and circulated. It's partly a memory of family history, but also very much in how I think no one over the years has ever really talked about architecture in Chandigarh and what the sort of architectural spaces and the modernist aesthetic, how that has shaped people's lives and how that has shaped the imaginary. And so I'll just begin and I'll talk a little bit, and then I have some pictures and I'll talk through it. But I would like to say that my talk is informal, it's exploratory, it's a little sort of love letter to Chandigarh and my childhood there and my important formative years there. And why is it important today? As heated debates about nationalism, citizenship, and identity are raging in India, it is perhaps an opportune moment to reflect on the genesis, vision, and reality of a truly unique Indian city, Chandigarh. It belongs to the period of the emergence of the Indian Constitution itself, the Constitution written by the famous Dalit leader that enshrined values such as caste-free equality and secularism, both of which are under threat in modern India. And several critics of Chandigarh often kind of sneeringly say, well, this was at the same time as the Constitution. And in a sense, I'm trying to highlight that that was exactly the values through which Chandigarh emerged. In the fragmenting of communities today under the call of Hindutva, many Indians, and I think especially in the diaspora, are blurring images of what is modernity. They are blurring images of Indian modernity with a regressive and exclusionary modern India. And so the vikas, I think, of the BJP is tied to some kind of neo-fascist fantasies of purity. So I want to rethink modernity and the meanings of modernity as they emerged in Chandigarh in the, from the mid-60s to the sort of early 1980s. And I just want to say that for this talk, I will strictly stick to that earlier periods, so when my grandfather came to Chandigarh in kind of mid 65, they came from Pakistan, and then my parents, and then sort of through the 70s, my childhood and growing up and adolescence and what the city was and what the values were. This talk will highlight the new post-independence Punjab via the formations of modernity envisioned in Chandigarh, the home of many displaced Punjabis, both Sikh and Hindu settlers in the sort of late 1960s through 70s and early 80s. I sort of stopped at the kind of mid 80s because then that was the period of the sort of neoliberal modernization of India. And then the meanings of the original years in Chandigarh change. And all of this, I can answer some questions or develop it later in my book. Given that the architectural vistas and spatial practices of Chandigarh reflected a complete break from the past, the question I want to ask is, how did this break give vitality to the city? The architecture of the city is so far removed from the colonial imperial designs of Lachit's Delhi, as well as the traditional Indian, whether it's Mughal, Rajasthani, Punjabi, the traditional styles of architecture. So in a way, as I said, that this is a genesis of book where I want to look at history, cultural memory, and architecture. I'm a literature person, so in many ways, my whatever strengths or skills lie in narratives, in rhetoric. And as I said, I was greatly, very impressed and deeply enriched by Radhika's talk about how memories and histories are entwined. My talk today is also very much a nostalgic tribute to my grandparents' parents and numerous extended families of Sikhs. These were military officers, they were government officers, and mostly migrants from Pakistan, or some parts of the family came from Pakistan after the partition. The word nostalgia, in Greek, nostos, sort of often implies pain, distress, and a homecoming. This is more from the, Iliad and Odyssey. I would like to see my talk as a happy homecoming, recollecting the values within which Chandigarh emerged. Who are these settlers? And I would also like to remind that above all, these settlers, these generations of families from the 60s to the 80s, they were totally secularists, cosmopolitans. They could embrace Ghalib as much as they could embrace Fabian socialism. And these were people who had lost everything in the partition. So I think that's a kind of interesting point for us to think about. So it is a nostalgia I evoke, not only what I think may be quite idyllic days in the early decades of the city. We all idealize maybe our childhood, and that's not the point. Not because life was easy for these migrants and immigrants and settlers, but because I think the values and the ideals that imbued the early vision of the city, and very much through its modernist architecture that I want to come back to, the values that imbued the early vision of the city had depth and resonance. People who had lost so much in the upheavals of the partition, as I saw in my own family, came with fresh hopes. And specifically, when we look at the Sikh culture, and I was very much a part of the Sikh community in Chandigarh, and I think even today and then about 13 to 15% of Chandigarh's population has been and continues to be Sikh. And it is very much a city of Punjabiyat, whether you're Hindu or Sikh. And I think following up on the talks we heard earlier on the 1984 issue, I think some aftermath, and that's not the subject of my talk, but some aftermath of that was very strongly felt in Chandigarh as some of the people involved in it, moved there. So Chandigarh was planned by Prime Minister Nehru in the aftermath of the tragic partition of India as the new capital of Punjab, which was divided, and the old capital of Lahore, which was a great cultural and intellectual center, was awarded to Pakistan. Chandigarh was designed by the French modern architect Le Corbusier, and the city's radical modernist aesthetics broke free both from India's colonial architecture as well as its traditional Indian heritage. Many of these early settlers, the 60s and 70s, were imbued with a deep nostalgia for Lahore. But I think the modernist emphasis of Chandigarh's buildings on form over ornament, of raw materials and structures instead of idyllic revivals, in a way helped them to embrace a completely different, unfamiliar new world. I think the loss of Lahore is hard for us to imagine today. And we were talking earlier in the paper about affective history. So the histories of Lahore at the time, and I think even sort of long after that, were very, very moving and painful. And for my grandparents' and parents' generation, it was where the currents of great Indian history, whether it was Mughal, Sikhs, and the Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh empire, which is so important for the Sikh imaginary, and even the later British colonists converged. But Lahore was also a site for the progressive intellectuals, for, whether it was Rajinder Singh Bedi or Faiz Ahmad Faiz or Amrita Pritam, it was a center of progressive cultural and intellectual movements. So the loss of Lahore was really big. And so what did it mean? What were the legacies of Lahore in Chandigarh? And I will briefly touch upon this, in my PowerPoint, which I will show sort of at the end of some comments, where you will see the collection of artifacts from the Lahore Museum that were divided. This was the division of the partition spoils that came to the Chandigarh Museum under the auspices of one of our great officers and Chief Commissioner at the time, M.S. Randhawa. So what I'm suggesting here is that this modernist architecture helped to shape newness, a break with the past, and mostly, I think, a kind of aesthetic, an emphasis on simplicity without excess, without the pretensions of ornament, which also, I think, at the time shaped a non-consumerist culture and the social and spatial practices of the period that came with it. In my longer version, I want to sort of look at this idea of spatial practices, coming from Michel de Certeau's Practice of Everyday Life, from Henry Lefebvre's Production of Space, which talk about three-way intersections between theory and practice, public and private, art and architecture, as well as the critical theory of the Frankfurt schools. But I think in large, my point here in having some kind of theoretical framework is to question how spaces encourage or call for self-reflection and social transformation. And what kind of spatial practices are those that question and transform the social conditions of the sites in which they intervene? And so in Chandigarh, I want to ask is, how did the architecture of Chandigarh, how did it and how does it generate self-reflection or social transformation? Or has Chandigarh itself become reified into a kind of static symbol of modernity, often, I think, caricatured and mocked at or simply ignored? And I think, again, none of these questions seem to be raised. People just go over the discussion of architecture or discuss it in purely kind of mechanistic terms, but rather than how it affected its inhabitants. Second is how, and this is the sort of larger question, and this is coming from another methodology, is how do these building spaces and gardens, which are very important in Chandigarh, serve and have served as sites from which multiple histories were and continue to be generated? How are the meanings of these architectural sites constantly changing, being mobilized for different causes or agendas? Did they produce a particular Chandigarh imaginary, a way in which citizens of the city imagine themselves differently from the rest of India? And I want to sort of talk of myself as, if I take an inventory of traces in terms of Edward Said, is what was the role of Chandigarh in the formation of my adolescence and my adulthood, and how did it shape my future life? Here, I'm also very much indebted to a wonderful book by Mrinalini Rajagopalan, which I hope to draw on. It's called The Archival and Affective Lives of 5 Monuments in Modern Delhi. And this is a 2016 book. I think it's a book I would highly recommend. And the author, with 5 case studies of Mughal buildings in Delhi, tries to present a role model for the study of building histories that seeks to redefine the architectural monument as not simply a static repository of the past, but also as a site from which multiple histories were and continue to be generated. As well, the book recognizes the fictions of the archive alongside the immediacy of affect for a more capacious history of the Indian monument. So again, we come back to the notion of affective histories that are generated by monuments. And she approaches the life of each monument backward as well as forward in time. So it's sort of moving back and forth to chart its historical permutations. So she doesn't use any kind of traditional chronology. And this method of historical arrangement, Rajagopalan shows, significantly offers the symbolic multiplicity of the monument over a period of time, created, as it were, within the shifting modalities of state-controlled archives, as well as an affective appropriation by proletarian actors. So, she arrives at sort of different findings, but I would like to just stress this terminology that I'm taking from her blurb, is that how we look at the multiplicity of buildings and monuments. So the Chandigarh architectural buildings, the Capitol complex, they have become monuments. They have been, sort of denigrated as set place spaces. But I think they're like almost, they're historical monuments. And how can we look at them through different moments of history? So Nehru had given a nice description of this and said the site is chosen free from the encumbrances of the old town, which would make the new city symbolic of the freedom of India, unfettered by traditions of the past, an expression of the nation's faith in the future. And this is very much, the Nehruvian vision. I know Nehru today in India, for various, political reasons, is questioned and, not venerated or respected. But I still think that it's really important, the choice he made to build a new city. After all, when I heard the talk on Amritsar, they could have said, well, let's just make Ludhiana, Amritsar, Jalandhar, Patiala, one of these old cities, one of the sort of royal cities, and make that into the new capital. And I think this was a kind of very daring move that served us all well. But over the years, social and cultural critics, as well as some scholars of architecture, have written on Chandigarh, but often in superficial terms. And I haven't read everything, but just over the years, I'm always looking for something that would, for me, have something meaningful on Chandigarh. And that's why I thought maybe I will try my hand at something. I will argue that the vision of the early settlers, many partition migrants, as they reflected on the modernist aesthetics of the city, they drew on the materials and memories of the lost cosmopolitan Punjab. But I think they very importantly, the modernist aesthetics helped them to create new principles that balanced modernity and secularism with traditional cultures. It was a city of, I would argue, an inclusive Punjabiyat, very inclusive Punjabiyat, synthesizing Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, and also Christian elements into the new Punjab. Chandigarh has always had a small Christian population and a Muslim population. But some of the responses to it have been either formulaic, there's a kind of lot of endless praise of the city beautiful, I think there's a Facebook page, or more pointedly has been a sharp criticism of its basic character. And a book that I found really troubling in recent years was a book by Sunil Khilnani called The Idea of India, which was very much acclaimed. It was in 1997, and not long ago, maybe 10 years ago, he came here to Michigan State and I heard him give a talk. And he is sort of one of India's, he's one of a social and cultural critic, and he reductively shrugged off the distinct identity of Chandigarh. And in a way, my book project is really coming from a riposte or an answer to him and other critics like him. And one of the statements he makes, which is really, I think, daring and audacious and unacceptable to me, is he says, this supremely conceptual city could not generate any shared understanding of its meaning among its inhabitants. And I think that is exactly the opposite. I think the conceptual spaces, the architecture, the way it was planned, shared many sort of points of reference for its inhabitants of different generations. And I think many of these critiques, such as Khilnani's, have missed is the perspective of the people who have lived in Chandigarh and how they experience the architectural ambience, the spatial practices that emerged from them, as well as the planned aspects of the city, which included the green spaces, the rose garden, the numerous green parks dotting the cities, and people's love of garden and plants, and the very broad boulevards and streets. And Chandigarh, I would like to very much praise, was a city of cycling and cyclists. And for years, everybody just was on their bike. And I heard recently that cycling has come back there. So I just wanted to add that here. So when I begin with Sunil Khilnani's this book of Idea of India, he first launches an assault on the genesis of the city, of Corbusier's attitude, and he calls him a megalomaniac. He talks of Corbusier's arrival and ways of working, as well as on how the city has evolved till then. Now, Corbusier, as many of you may know, has been kind of criticized because he has been associated with the Vichy government in occupied France, and he's been associated with anti-Semitism. And I certainly don't want to defend him in any personal terms. I want to look at his great contribution to the world of architecture and space and the concepts around it, and not to his personal morality. And this book, Khilnani's book, makes some sweeping generalizations without any substantiation or voices of the city. Ironically, however, some of his critiques reveal what were the exact strengths of the special features of Chandigarh. So one point he makes is, he says, Chandigarh boldly divested itself of history, rejecting both colonial imagery and nationalist sentimentalism or ornament. The literal utilitarian names of its axial avenues, Madhya Marg, Uttar Marg, Central Avenue, North Avenue. It has no nationalist monuments. The city's radical meaning lay in its cultural unfamiliarity, its proposal of the new. It refused to concede anything to its location and acted as a kind of shock to India's built environment, celebrating a wholly alien form, style, and material. And I think this is precisely what many of us, including myself, would celebrate about the city, is exactly its cultural unfamiliarity. That even, when we were growing up in Chandigarh and we went to other cities like maybe Rajasthan cities or Delhi, we would see how distinct Chandigarh is. So while seeming to acknowledge in positive terms Chandigarh's architecture, Khilnani does an about face and then collapses the city's unique architecture and landscape and critiques the main buildings of the capital complex, which I'll just show you in my PowerPoint, as a reproduction of Delhi. And he says, oh, it is just reproducing the same fetishism of the capital and bureaucracy. He also variously and casually makes sweeping statements like this was a monumental city condemned to revolve around the life of its people in Punjab, a glorious stage set where the monuments of state may be enacted, and so forth. So what is the main features of the architecture of Chandigarh? And I would like to highlight the very point he sneers at, the break with the past, the refusal to conform to any nationalist style. And briefly, the style of architecture that Corbusier, at least in Chandigarh, I don't think it's uniform, was called brutalism or a brutalist architecture. It wasn't from the word brutal, but deriving from béton brut, which meant raw concrete, first associated with some of his buildings when he designed in Marseille in the late 1940s. Brutalism was a post-war architectural style defined by the use of simple block-like forms, usually made from cast concrete or brick. It was characterized by massive, heavily textured raw concrete and angular geometric spaces. Brutalism thrived between the 50s and 70s. And so, Chandigarh, a lot of it is very brutalist, these heavy concrete block-like forms, the simplicity, the rawness, the sense of, being dug from the ground. And so very much, but I think, Corbusier, from what I have read and know, has also different kinds of, forms of modernity. So all of it wasn't this simple block-like forms. Khilnani also talks of it as a tableau of state, as a city of politicians and government officials, very mockingly. And I think his critique, which came in the mid-90s, is simply a 1990s celebration of globalization, of neoliberal critique of earlier proto-socialist economies. Chandigarh is, certainly it had social hierarchies, but the initial vision through the 70s and even 80s was to build housing of every class of person. There is quote unquote government housing all over the city. And I agree, there are class hierarchies and, we can discuss that. But on the other hand, there was a sense of a right to space, a right to homes. And what is interesting in Khilani's book, he doesn't mention any educational institutions. He talks of the Chandigarh lacked any of the productive economy of modernity. And so a lot of these educational institutions very much form the structures of modernity. I will now just show you the rest of my talk through a PowerPoint, which I think, and I will do a quick screen share here, and which Alex showed me. And play from start. I hope you can all see this. Okay. So, oops, I'm just trying to, sorry, it'll just take me a minute to, okay. So I just start with, what I said earlier. This is just a replay and I will sort of move on from here. I'm just trying to navigate. Okay, I think now I can. Sorry, I will figure this out here. Okay. So this is, let's see. Oh, I can't see the images. I will figure this out in a moment. They can see my screen. I can't see the images here. Oh my gosh. This is a crisis.
Here, I can share the screen with the
Now,
image.
can you please share this? Can you do the screen so can you just run it by me? I think that will be better. I'll stop the share. If you can run it by me, because you had the original, so you should be able to see this. Yeah. So if you could just move on next. And next, yeah. So we start with the memories of Lahore. Lahore was very central and, to the sort of imaginings of Punjabis, of Sikhs. And this is a formal portrait of Ranjit Singh. Next. And this is the foundations of the modern Lahore fort, which dated to 1566 during the reign of Emperor Akbar, who bestowed the fort with a syncretic architectural style that featured both Islamic and Hindu motifs. So I'm putting these images here because this would be the architectural legacy that people had who left Lahore, who left Pakistan, who left the old India and came to Chandigarh. So this would be their visuals, their kind of points of reference to architecture. And so, of course, the fort was used by Emperor, Ranjit Singh, founder of the Sikh Empire, who's very, very important to Sikhs. And then later on, of course, by the British. Next, please. So this here, I'm just repeating what I said, that many of the earlier settlers were imbued with a deep nostalgia for Lahore, but these buildings really helped them to overcome it. And what I just spoke about, the brutalist architecture, a style that emerged in the 50s and grew out of the early 20th century modernist movements, what I mentioned earlier. So we can move on. Okay, so this is a wonderful picture of Corbusier looking at the Capitol complex. This is the Legislative Assembly. And there was a critique that, oh, Corbusier just flew down 3 times and he didn't come again. And I thought this is a very personal view, and this is very much a part of his vision. Please go next. This is the Rose Garden. And if any one of you have been to Chandigarh, I think the architectural aesthetic, the brutalist modernist aesthetic is very much interspersed with gardens, greenery, trees. And this was, a lot of this was the vision of M.S. Randhawa, who was our chief commissioner through the 60s and 70s. So he, planted many trees. So the Chandigarh I remember is always the modernism and gardens. Please, next. So this is a Corbusier studio and his home. And this is, when I went there, I told my friend, I said, this is a Chandigarh house. So you can see how in my imaginings, and this is a building, very simple building. And this was his studio where he lived from 34 to 65. And this is where he designed everything. And you can see the colors. And if you can please move on. And this is, he talks to, in 51, he was appointed architectural advisor to the Punjab government for the designing of Chandigarh. And he was, a painter, a poet, a sculptor, a visionary. And you will see his tapestries designed in the High Court. Please, next. So this is the Legislative Assembly. And I think these are beautiful buildings. They're always a little washed out by the rain, and you can see the concrete and you can see the raw materials, and they are surrounded by these pools of water. Unfortunately today, and I won't mention today, they're all too heavily guarded and too much police and so forth because of the times we live in. And next, please. So this is the inside of the Legislative Assembly. And this is, again, very, traditional Corbusier style, the squares and the variety of shapes. He was always known for the variety of shapes, in terms of vertical and horizontal and rounds. And next, please. This is my favorite. All over Chandigarh, you find these covers of sewages, what you call manholes, and they are the original master plan of Corbusier. Unfortunately, this being India, some of them have been stolen and sold in Paris. But this is one right outside our family home, and at least 2 years ago, I found it still exists. And this is just a very small vignette, and all over the city you would find these. Next, please. So Chandigarh is laid out as a grid system, white boulevard, connect all 56 sectors. And these are the old sectors. I won't talk of Chandigarh today. And each sector is a self-contained macro neighborhood with shops, schools, etc. The surroundings are green too, with parks and tree-lined avenue to soften the effects of its largely concrete block-like building. So I think that's something that people never see. They talk of the architecture as if it's removed from the green landscape. Thank you. Next. So these are tapestries designed by Corbusier in the High Court building. And I'm going to be personal and say that this was one of my father's courtroom. My father used to be a judge here. And I went back there after he died a few years ago. And this was the courtroom. So this is one of the, and we were not allowed, I sort of, illegally took this photograph. Next, please. And this is the High Court. This is a beautiful building, and the colors and the simplicity and the, just the shapes. Next, please. And this is another view of the High Court. So another thing, when people say Chandigarh doesn't have modernity, it is a very big center of the law. It has a huge population of lawyers who deal with a lot of business, dealing with Delhi and generally with the north of India. And we can just observe this, but you can see this, the modernist, brutalist, the concrete blocks, the slabs, the simplicity, and the only thing that breaks it is these dabs of color. Next. And I think we shouldn't forget that Chandigarh is in the shadow of the hills of the Himalayas. And so here you have a scene of the Himalayas. And I think I just wanted to read the text here. That central to the vision of Chandigarh was architects like Sharma, who worked with Corbusier. And there were also connections on one hand with Lahore and the sculpture, as well as the new Pahari and Sikh paintings, which I'll just talk about in a moment. Next, please. So this is the Chandigarh Museum and Art Gallery. And I think Radhika's talk really brought me back here. And I've just given very short vignettes. This has a very amazing collection, which ties us to the legacies of Lahore, of Indian history. And this was, really the brainchild of Randhawa. If you could go next, please. So the Pahari painting, this was a real find. There was a great art historian who still, I think, lives there, B.N. Goswami. And so these Pahari paintings, and a lot of them were Sikh paintings, of the Sikh gurus. This one on the right is of Guru Gobind Singh, and on the left is Geet Govind. And these were, quote unquote, discovered sort of, I think, in the kind of gradually in the late 20th century, 1950s, 1960s. And apparently MS Randhawa just went around these hill states and went to the Maharajas and palaces and found many of these paintings. And many of them were first displayed at the museum. And I remember this conversations about these paintings. And these were artists who had originally had associations with Mughal artists, and then they had all dispersed. Next, please. So this is the other complete treasures. These are the Gandhara statues, which came from originally from Afghanistan, the Bamia area, which was bombed by the Taliban. And these are the ones that India received as the share of the Lahore Museum's collection at the time of the partition of India. So these are a very great link to the history of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and to Buddhist times, and to the Greek influence on Buddhist statues. So these are Buddhist statues. These are wonderful to watch. I remember being taken here when I was in school to watch the Grecian tapestries on Buddhist, or sculptures. Next, please. And so here, the collections in the modern museum reflect the vision of the early settlers, many partition migrants of Chandigarh. So Chandigarh had a very distinct kind of cultural identity at the time. Within the modernist aesthetics of the architecture lay the memories and the materials of the lost Punjab and the 18th and 19th century worlds of the hill states. So these hill states had a profusion of painters and artists in the 18th and 19th centuries after the Mughal Empire broke up. But M.S. Randhawa collected these paintings around the 50s and 60s when Chandigarh opened. And again, you can see new principles that balance modernity and secularism with traditional culture. So it was a very distinct vision. And I don't have time, but if you go to the museum, you will see that. It also has collections of Rorik, who painted the Himalayas, and it also has paintings of Hussein. It has lots of Punjab textiles, pulkaris, and there's contemporary, there's a friend of mine right now in Chandigarh, Jaswinder Kaur, who's published an amazing book on Punjab textiles. So I'll just give a little plug for her here. Next, please. And so what was the Chandigarh modernist aesthetic reflected in the simple utilitarian homes of the 60s and 70s? Contrast them with the recent homes that I call Punjabi Baroque, reflecting four Mughal styles. And this is my home sector. If you can just go on and I can quickly show you these. We're running out of time. Yeah. Next, please. So this is the neighborhood where I grew up in. And these were the homes vintage, this is Sector 9, built in the sort of late, early 60s, very simple, very utilitarian. But a common practice was that they planted flowers and greeneries outside the boundary hall. So this is a house of one of my relatives. This is another house from some of our friends. Yeah, next, please. This is one of my favorite houses. I call it the house of the sagging gate. This is probably earlier. And these are the homes. Everything was simple. Everything was utilitarian. People had windows and doors and balconies and from local materials. And these were, you would say they were kind of officials. This was a sort of slightly upper class sectors. Next, please. This is our family home, which I'm showing. So this was very simple and utilitarian, to which stories were added. So as the families grew, you added stories on this. But you always had gardens. Next, please. So now this is a new house. This is what I call the Punjabi Baroque. This is by an immigrant from London. It's called Sherawala Kar, means the house of the lions. And this has all these lions. It has a coat of arms. So as people are buying the new old Corbusier style modernist houses, they are demolishing them and trying to revive it in some ancient architecture like this. Next, please. This was a family friend's house. It was very simple, and they demolished it, they sold it, and you have these pineapples, and you have all kinds of, the jharokas and balconies, kind of for Mughal, for sort of ancient. Next, please. And then I'm just going to, this is, the Mrinalini Rajagopalan's book, which I was talking. And I think there's one more slide, and that's really important. So one part of my book, I want to talk about the relationship between Chandigarh and Anandpur Sahib. Everybody, Amritsar is very strong in what Sikhism is and the Gurdwara in Amritsar. But I think Anandpur Sahib was a very important Gurdwara. This is Nada Sahib. This is a Gurdwara outside Chandigarh and Panchkula. It's associated with Guru Gobind Singh. Unfortunately, this building is not old. This was later constructed, where he stopped here on the way, I think during his last battle, and he stayed here with somebody. And this is like you come and make a wish here. So I think there hasn't been anything done about how important Anandpur Sahib was to people in Chandigarh, how often we went there, and now there's a museum there. So I will sort of end here. I think there's a question on something about the image. And then I'm saying that Sunil Khilnani wrongly observed that this supreme conceptual city could not generate any shared understanding of its meanings among its inhabitants. And so I hope that I've shown you how the first generations of settlers drew on the modernist architectural principles to bravely embrace simple utilitarian housing across different social classes. A socialist vision of fair distribution of government allotted houses informed a non-consumerist vision that highlighted green, spacious places, streets for bicycles, and open spaces and squares within which to congregate. Thank you so much. I think we can close the PowerPoint. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alex, for rescuing me.
Thank you, Professor Singh. That was a fantastic presentation, and the images really helped to bring the first part of your presentation to life for us. So thank you for all those photos.
Oh my God. I'm looking for questions here.
Yeah, so I thought I would start just by trying to tie all three of the presentations
together.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And I came up with a bunch of word clusters that I think are relevant to all three of the papers. So thinking about city, space, and place, thinking about urbanity, thinking about memory, history, and ethnography, thinking about architectures, institutions, and how they shape citizens and subjects. If we think about Dr. Aggarwal's paper in the beginning, ideas of affect, sentiment, nostalgia. And then I think what really came out for me after listening to your paper, even though it's in an early stage, is how we come up with methods and methodologies for really thinking about urban space post 47 and also post 84. So that those are just some general themes and ideas. And I thought I would just start by asking you a quick question.
Sure.
I was really struck by your use of the term settler. And I was wondering if there's a particular reason why you're evoking the idea of settlers, which could convey ideas of
colonialism,
power, violence, or the original inhabitants of a place. And then is there a difference between using settler versus migrant, or thinking about refugees, for example, that resettled in Delhi? And then after you address that, maybe I can read off a couple more questions in the chat.
Sure. Thank you so much. I should explain, I understand, because I study colonialism, that there's a settler colonialism in Canada and Australia and all of that. This comes from my grandmother. My grandmother, who used to talk in Punjab, she says, "Asi ta Chandigarh aake settle hoye, to tusi kithe settle hoye." They would use the word, that means I came and settled in Chandigarh. And so she didn't talk that much English, she talked more Punjabi. She would always use the word settle. And among her friends, and I should have explained that. So I deliberately kind of was ventriloquizing my grandmother and seeing of them, where did you settle? Asita Delhi settle. You understand Punjabi, right? So I think it came from that. And also I think they felt very much that they had to settle. And they didn't like the word refugees. I remember people who were refugees, and not only in Chandigarh, we had lots of family who were, who all came from Pakistan. They never liked to be called refugees. And so migrant is a more modern, I think it's more, we use it today. But I thank you so much, because I should have made that, talking to an audience, I should have made why I'm using the word settler.
I think that's fascinating.
From my grandmother.
Right. And also in terms of thinking about the different inhabitants of the city that you might be mapping and what kind of terms they might be using. That's great. So Manohar Singh asks, Jyotsna, how have different faith communities inhabited the city? Have different spaces emerged over time? And are these spaces informed by the brutalist architecture? Or have people sought to create more familiarly Indian spaces? And then I'll also read Harjeet's question. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could comment on the connections between the architecture and the natural landscape. one of the things I remember about the city is the connection between the brutalist form and the mountainous backdrop. How do the architectural natural form impact the habitus of urbanites and visitors? How is the architecture reflected and perhaps complicated by Chandigarh's status as a capital? So I think those two questions work.
Yeah,
well.
so the first one was the green spaces and the architecture and the mountains. Yeah. Sorry. I apologize. So I think the one is which I didn't talk about enough. The mountains were very important also to our sensibility. You know, you could go up the mountains. We would go in the summer in the mountains. And I think those are very, like symbiotic relationship between the mountains and this architecture. So the architecture, which seems harsh if you just, say, oh, these blocks of concrete, there's a really kind of contrast between the architecture and the mountains. And the mountains are also, they can be quite high and they can be quite forbidding. But then the greenery all around the city, the gardens, the parks, it was just, it's funny, looking back in my memory, I'm able to synthesize it better now than when I was living there. And so I think the habitus of urbanites and visitors, and I think now Chandigarh has been a divided city. And I think things have changed a lot in Chandigarh because everybody's living on their phones and all of the media world. But I think prior to the media world, that's why I use mid-80s as a kind of cutting off point. I think one lived more in the outside world. As I said, everybody was on bicycles, which is hard to think of now. Or there were not so many cars in Chandigarh. People just didn't have cars. And so the architecture had different meaning. And of course, now it's very complicated because it's a divided city. It's the capital of 2 states. The government buildings are surrounded by police and there have been terrorist attacks over the years. And, it's very different, but I still think the basic architecture holds and the gardens are there. And I think that has not changed at all. And so the mountains are also, of course, now at that time, when Chandigarh was the capital of Punjab, all of Himachal was under Punjab. It was all Punjab. So, the country has become divided. And so Nehru's vision was of Chandigarh, head of all Himachal, Haryana, and the new Punjab. But thank you. I mean, this is all really good. And the other question was the different communities. I think, and I'm sad to say, and I hate to come to the present because, as I said, what I learned from my family was secularism, and we never heard anything against Muslims, ever. And you can imagine these were people who came from the partition, and you know the India we live in now, and it was and they were, I don't think there was much of a Muslim population. There were Christians in Chandigarh, but the Hindus, and I think 50% is Hindus and 15 is Sikhs. But Sikhs are very dominant in the politics, in Akali politics, and I think at creating more. I don't know if there are spaces, but like you would have open bazaars near the university. The university campus was really lovely. I didn't think people were trying to create more Indian spaces outside, within their homes. I mean, you could do things. But I think gardens, maybe in the gardens, they would have maybe Indian sculptures and things like that. But there was a lot of cultural life. There was a very good theater department. There was, Al-Qazi would come from Delhi. There was Balwant Gargi. There was a lot of Punjabi theater. So I don't think, as far as the architecture, as far as I know, and I may be wrong, I don't think there was any sense that this was a foreign architecture. This was our architecture. This was our city. We lived in it. And that's why when I went to Corbusier's house, I had a weird feeling. I said, this is Chandigarh, this is not Corbusier's house. This is my home. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that your last discussion about secularism actually ties really well to Nicola's Muni's question. She says, Jyotsna, what a fascinating project. Could you speak a little more to the habitus of secular modernity in Chandigarh? How do people come to embody and live these ideas and identities through how they inhabit the spaces? For instance, in terms of the scale and difference and globalism of Corbusier's architecture, but also in terms of the parks, gardens, and cyclists that you briefly mentioned. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, given your own family experiences. this internalized secularism?
I think the thing is, there was a Gurdwara in Sector 9. My grandmother was very religious. And by secular, I don't mean people were very much, you would have all a Khan part, you would have all kinds of kirtans. You had all Sikh, as we know, had Sikh events. And my grandmother had a Granth Sahib in the house. So we were invested in Sikh rituals and practices and weddings. Weddings in those days, people just, pitched a tent in their garden and had a wedding, So all of the rituals were there, but there was never any discussion. There was never any talk of anti-Muslims. In fact, that generation could, memorize Ghalib. They knew Persian. They knew, my father had majored in Persian. They knew Urdu. They knew the languages. So they could not tear themselves away from the culture, which was a Muslim culture. And this is true of Delhi too. When people say partition, I said the people who came from the partition, whether they were Sikh or Hindu, they were imbued in a syncretic culture, which was, a lot of it was Muslim. Can you imagine taking away Muslim culture from India? Is a big loss. So I think it's the cultural syncretism that they brought with them. They all spoke Urdu. That generation, they knew Urdu, they could read it. So I think that was sort of so rich. And yes, and the life was outdoors. There was no media, we lived much less. And the architecture was, again, I feel it broke away from the past. There was no shadows of Havelis, which people are now trying to build. There was no shadows of tradition. So it was like a blank slate. But the museums were filled with a lot of archaeology and history, as we showed. And I heard in Anandpur Sahib, I haven't been there, there's a big Sikh museum of some kind in the last few years. I haven't seen that.
Okay, I'm going to move over and ask a question from Professor Gurpal Singh. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You're right to speak of the relationship between Nehru's vision for India and the role of Chandigarh as the capital of Punjab after the loss of Lahore. Can you say something about the place of Chandigarh after Nehru, but before neoliberalism of the 80s? To what extent did it capture the modernist imagination during the years of Mrs. Gandhi and her opposition to its divisions?
I think that's a very good question. I think I had left by the mid 80s, but I know that during, from what I know is that during the 80s, it had huge repercussions, 1984 in Chandigarh. In fact, Simranjeet Singh Maan was our neighbor. He used to live down the street from us. So a lot of that came. But then Chandigarh also, I think the government had this very repressive police machinery that put down what they call the insurgency. I'm not, I don't know enough of that history. So I think there were some divisions among Sikh communities, which I know of. There was a lot of division among Sikh communities. And I think one thing you have to remember, by the mid 80s, they were quote unquote settlers. A lot of people moved to Chandigarh from other parts of the new Punjab. So Patiala and Gurdaspur and, Jalandhar, large, and they brought a lot of money. A lot of the land, they sold it, and Chandigarh was a nice place. So Chandigarh changed in the mid 80s because of the infusion of new, mostly Sikhs, I think, mostly Sikhs. And they were, I don't know enough, but there were Sikhs from, if you're a Sikh from Patiala and if you're a Sikh from Rawalpindi, there's all that kind of intra-Sikh issues. So some of that came up through the 80s and 90s among the Sikhs themselves. And so the generation I'm idealizing and talking was a sort of first, second, third, quote unquote, settlers who came from Pakistan. Or had, if not all of them, some parts of every family had connections to Lahore and the old world.
Yeah, I think focusing on generational differences as a kind of methodological orientation would be really fascinating in this project. So there's two questions about architecture, and I'll kind of combine them.
Sure.
Harjeet asked, Jyotsna, you showed an image of the Lahori fort constructed by Akbar and mentioned that he combined pre-existing motifs. Can you reflect on the difference between what Chandigarh migrants left architecturally, a combined architectural form, and Chandigarh's, quote, radical cultural unfamiliarity, unquote?
Thank you so much. I think the response to that is more what you can see, in the last decade or so in Chandigarh, that for many years, nobody tried to combine the form. But as the old houses are being demolished, the new houses are, and that's why I call it Punjabi Baroque. The new houses are kind of going back into those jharokas and, the Mughal, the little, minaret style things and stuff like that. So I think that this is more the newness. And I have to say many of these, I don't want to generalize, many of these are immigrants also from the West. Like that house, which is our house, I call it the Sheramwala Kar, that has a coat of arms. I don't know where that is, that's very British. They have a coat of arms in their front door. So I think that people are trying to make it culturally familiar. They're trying to, put cultural familiarity in the architecture. But I haven't, as I said, I haven't been to Chandigarh in 2 years. I mean, I go often and I hope to go and, spend it. I mean, I go almost every other year until the pandemic. It's grown so much. It's a very different city, but I think the basic modernist style has not changed. It's still quite simple. It's still utilitarian. It's still very box-like. And, if people have money, they do these other things. But I still think its basic character architecturally has not radically changed, except it's no longer unfamiliar to us. It's become familiar. It's become, so when I'm in Paris, I'm thinking of Chandigarh, so it's in a way become familiar. But that's, these are really, this has really helped me a lot to even think about these things.
And I have one final question, and then we should start wrapping up. Because we're getting close to time. Bali Sahota asks, fascinating presentation. I'm wondering how Le Corbusier's architecture in Chandigarh compares with his work in other locales of the subcontinent, such as Bhubaneswar or Ahmedabad. Is it keeping with modernist internationalism, or does location matter?
Okay, thank you. I think Sunil Khilnani also talked of location. I have to confess, I haven't been to either city. I have some books about Ahmedabad. I'm very interested in some of the housing he did there, for the Sarabhais and some families. I think one of the things people have said that Nehru built Chandigarh to make it international city. And in a way, that's true. And I have to visit these cities to see, and I think modernism is just not that in anymore in its original sense in India. And I'm just interested. I mean, in Michigan, in East Lansing, we have the Great Broad Museum that I would welcome you all to visit by Zaha Hadid, which is an amazing modernist architecture. So I think I'm not able to answer, but thank you so much. Thank you all for. I was very nervous. And thank you all very much. And I will dedicate, inshallah, when my book comes out, I will dedicate this webinar to that. And thank you, Arvind, so much. Such a pleasure to see you.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. This is really exciting and really fruitful to think about that forthcoming book.
Thank you. And thanks to Radhika and Yamini and Harjeet and Alex. And this was a nice weekend, well spent.
So with that,
Anneeth, I hope we meet in person sometime.
I know, yes, we have to. It would be great for us all to get together soon at some point.
You're a Michigander, you should just come back.
And UC Irvine is also a home of brutalist architecture, by the way. This looks like my campus here.
Yeah. So. In England, when I was in St. Catherine's College, that's modernist architecture, because Oxford had a new college. They just decided to break away with the past.
Right.
So when I was there, people said, we don't look like Oxford. I said, you look like my hometown. And that was a Swedish later architect, but they had furniture and everything too. Thank you all so much, and hope we will all meet again. And thank you, Radhika. I will get your book on the city and learn more from that.
I'm going to turn it over to Arvind now to wrap up, but if all the presenters want to come back on and turn on their videos, that would be great to see.
Yeah, that would be nice, exactly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anneeth, for doing that. Thank you to all three presenters, Yamini, Radhika, and Jyotsna, for fascinating and engaging talks, well beyond what I could have expected. So thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for wonderful questions and for facilitating this. And of course, to my colleagues, Anneeth, Harjeet, and Alex, very, very trustworthy colleagues. I'm glad to have you guys on board always. So just a quick word about the next set of webinars. As you know, we planned 3 for next year, but most likely we're going to have 4. So the next webinar will be at the end of January. And one of the things that we're trying to introduce is a book forum. So new books that are out, topical books. We may be discussing one as an addition to what we are already doing. As you know, the Punjab elections are sometime at the end of February and early March next year. So we're planning an extra webinar to analyze the results of that election and its implications. Some very, very interesting stuff that's going on around that. So that's going to be the extra webinar. So there may be 4 next year, and then one on partition sometime in late April, and then one in September. So yeah, a lot to look forward to next year. Thank you all for everything. Thank you to all the participants. I'm going to sign off in a second or two. So
thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to
so much.
Lovely. Thank you, Radhika and Yamini. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
great.
I will leave to a cold Michigan day here.
It is cold. It's warming up, but it's
yeah. Take care, everybody. Take care.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.